The desert did not defeat Erwin Rommel. Arithmetic did. By October 1942, the Axis position in North Africa extended across hundreds of miles of sand and rock, supplied through ports that could not deliver what the front consumed. The Afrika Korps and supporting Italian formations fielded roughly 100,000 men combined, with fewer than 500 operational tanks at the decisive moment. Fuel shipments crossing the Mediterranean bled under Allied naval and air interdiction. Tankers carrying tens of thousands of barrels were sunk before unloading. A single panzer division could burn through hundreds of tons of fuel in a week of sustained maneuver. Rommel did not lack audacity. He lacked petrol. Across the line at El Alamein, General Bernard Montgomery assembled the British Eighth Army with over 200,000 men, supported by more than 1,000 tanks and artillery batteries capable of firing thousands of shells per hour. Ammunition stockpiles behind the line measured in the hundreds of thousands of rounds. Fuel reserves accumulated deliberately, stored in depots holding tens of thousands of gallons to ensure that when the offensive began, it would not stall for want of supply. Montgomery did not rush. He concentrated. The geography compressed the fight into a narrow corridor between the Mediterranean Sea and the Qattara Depression. There would be no wide flanking sweep across open desert. Movement funneled into defined sectors. Minefields stretched for miles, seeded with hundreds of thousands of anti-tank and anti-personnel mines. Engineers would need to carve corridors under fire, lifting devices designed to fracture steel tracks and human bone alike. Inside a British Sherman tank idling before the assault, the crew felt the engine vibrate beneath armor measuring several inches at the front glacis. The 75mm gun loaded shells weighing around 15 pounds. Sweat gathered despite the night air. The desert, which by day baked metal to blistering heat, now cooled sharply. Orders were clear. Advance through pre-cleared lanes, maintain formation, do not break into unmarked ground. Montgomery initiated Operation Lightfoot on October 23, 1942, with an artillery barrage that fired thousands of shells in the opening hours. Guns discharged rounds weighing over 20 pounds each in coordinated sequence. The sound rolled across the desert in continuous concussion. Infantry advanced first to clear paths through mine belts, followed by armor. Progress measured not in miles but in yards per hour. Rommel's defensive line did not collapse immediately. Axis anti-tank guns, including the German 88mm, fired armor-piercing rounds capable of penetrating several inches of steel at significant range. British tanks advancing into kill zones were hit and burned, casualties mounted. Yet Axis fuel stocks were already critically low. Some German units reported operational fuel reserves measured in days, not weeks. When armored counterattacks launched, they consumed irreplaceable gallons. I once compared Axis supply manifests from September and October 1942 with British logistical records from the same period. The disparity was stark. Allied convoys, protected by increasing naval dominance in the Mediterranean, delivered steady shipments measured in thousands of tons monthly. Axis deliveries, even when not intercepted, failed to meet frontline demand. Consumption outpaced arrival. That imbalance predates the first artillery shell of El Alamein. As the battle extended into late October and early November, British forces applied pressure methodically. Fresh divisions rotated into sectors where units had absorbed heavy losses. Replacement tanks arrived from depots in Egypt. Axis units could not replenish at equal pace. Italian formations, already strained, fractured under sustained assault. German panzer divisions fought skillfully, but with dwindling ammunition and fuel. Engines stalled not from mechanical failure, but from empty tanks. Picture a German Panzer IV attempting to reposition under artillery fire. The hull weighs over 20 tons. The engine requires precise fuel-air mixture to function. The commander orders movement, but the gauge reads near empty. A decision forms: counterattack now and risk immobilization, or withdraw and concede ground. In war, such calculations determine survival. Montgomery refused premature exploitation. He absorbed initial setbacks, recalibrated axes of advance, and concentrated armor for breakthrough at the right moment. On November 2nd, Operation Supercharge targeted weakened sectors. British forces committed fresh armored brigades against Axis lines already thinned. When the breach widened, Rommel faced encirclement risk. Without sufficient fuel to maneuver freely, withdrawal became imperative. Axis casualties and equipment losses accumulated rapidly. Hundreds of tanks were destroyed or abandoned. Thousands of prisoners were taken. The defensive line that had held for months fractured under sustained weight of fire and superior logistics. Rommel ordered retreat westward, but retreat in desert warfare demands fuel for every mile. Vehicles lacking gasoline were left behind. El Alamein did not represent a spontaneous collapse of German tactical skill. It marked the point at which Allied industrial capacity, logistical preparation, and concentrated firepower outpaced Axis endurance. Montgomery's preparation emphasized stockpiling, coordination, and deliberate tempo. Rommel's operational flexibility eroded under supply constraints and numerical inferiority. Strategically, the victory prevented Axis advance toward the Suez Canal and Middle Eastern oil fields. It also synchronized with Allied landings in Morocco and Algeria days later, tightening pressure from both east and west. The Afrika Korps would continue fighting across Libya and Tunisia, but its offensive capability had been broken. When I revisit after-action assessments from British and German perspectives, what stands out is not rhetoric, but fuel columns and ammunition tables. Rommel requested additional shipments measured in thousands of tons that never arrived intact. Montgomery delayed his attack until he possessed overwhelming stockpiles. War, at its core, often reduces to who can sustain pressure longer. If you are listening now, perhaps as night settles quietly, imagine the desert after artillery falls silent. Burned-out tanks rest in sand, their metal cooling under stars. Somewhere, a convoy inches westward, engines conserving every remaining gallon. The wind moves across dunes without regard for victory or defeat. The noise of battle fades into memory, replaced by the steady hum of retreating engines. This is the entire history of why Rommel lost at El Alamein, Montgomery's masterpiece. Chapter 1. The Last Viable Line. The 23rd of July, 1942. A Royal Engineers survey officer sits in a canvas-roofed tent somewhere between the Mediterranean coast and the edge of the Egyptian interior, working through a set of topographical cross-sections by the light of a kerosene lamp. Outside, the desert is dark and absolutely still. The tent smells of damp paper and machine oil. He is not drawing a battle plan. He is reading the ground, measuring the slope angles of a geological formation roughly 40 kilometers south of his position, calculating soil-bearing capacity against vehicle weight, translating the ancient physics of salt and clay into the language of modern warfare. On his map, someone has already drawn a pencil line between the coast and the edge of the Qattara Depression. The line is short. It is only about 64 kilometers wide. That pencil line will become one of the most consequential boundary marks in the history of the Second World War. The depression itself doesn't look like a weapon on a standard military map. It looks like a blank space, a pale, featureless nothing pressed against the southern edge of the coastal corridor. But when you read the survey notes alongside the map, something shifts entirely. The Qattara Depression covers roughly 18,000 square kilometers and sits 436 feet below sea level at its lowest recorded point. Its floor is a crystalline salt crust, overlaying waterlogged clay and gypsum substrate, producing a bearing capacity of less than 0.3 kilograms per square centimeter. For reference, a Panzer III tank in operational condition weighs approximately 22.5 tons and requires a surface bearing capacity of at least 1.2 kilograms per square centimeter to move without sinking. The depression didn't just restrict Rommel's movement, it made his entire strategic philosophy, the deep flanking hook that had broken every British position from Cyrenaica to the Egyptian border, physically impossible. The ground itself said no. What I find genuinely fascinating when I sit with the survey documents from this period, alongside the operational histories, is how rarely this geological fact is given its proper weight in popular accounts. Rommel's defeat at El Alamein is almost always narrated as the story of a better supplied army meeting a better organized mind. That is not untrue, but it is incomplete. The British were fighting in the one position in 800 kilometers of desert coastline, where Rommel could not go around them. That was not an accident of chance. It was a choice, made by Claude Auchinleck in July of 1942, to fall back no further than the point where geography locked the door. The pencil line on that map was the first decision of the battle. Everything else followed from it. The first battle at El Alamein, fought across July of 1942, established the line's viability in blood rather than theory. Auchinleck's 8th Army, battered and stretched after weeks of retreat from Gazala, fought the Panzer Armee Afrika to a standstill across 27 days of attritional combat. The Afrika Korps War Diary recorded, with unmistakable frustration, that there was no room to deploy and that attacks could only proceed frontally. For a commander who had built his entire operational method on the axis of movement and the oblique approach, that phrase, "no room to deploy," is a professional death sentence. Rommel attacked again and again across July, each time into the same narrow corridor, each time meeting a defense that had no flanks to turn. The First Battle of El Alamein ended in stalemate, which was, for the British, the closest thing to victory they had managed in months. The mechanics of the Depression's impassability deserve more technical attention than they usually receive. The salt crust that forms the Qattara's surface looks solid. In photographs from the period, it appears almost lunar, flat, pale, faintly luminous in the desert sun. But when concentrated point-load pressure is applied, the kind of pressure produced by a tank's narrow steel tracks, the crust fractures, and the vehicle sinks into the waterlogged substrate beneath. British engineers had calculated this as early as 1940. Rommel's own planning staff knew it too. No serious Axis study of a southern bypass was ever completed, not because the Germans lacked imagination, but because the geological reality was confirmed by every survey they attempted. The Depression was not a tactical inconvenience. It was a strategic wall built by the Pleistocene epoch and confirmed by 20th century soil mechanics. I want to be precise about something that is sometimes blurred in the standard narrative. When Bernard Montgomery arrived at 8th Army headquarters on the 13th of August, 1942, and announced that the withdrawal plans would be burned, that the army would stand and die at El Alamein if necessary, he was making a psychological declaration of extraordinary power. But he was not making a strategic discovery. The decision to hold at El Alamein, the recognition that this specific 64-kilometer corridor was the one place in the western desert where a British army could not be outflanked, had already been made. The man who made it was Auchinleck. Montgomery's genius was real and considerable, but it began on a foundation he did not build, and that distinction matters. The logistical implications of the Alamein position, and this is where the geography becomes inseparable from the operational story, were equally transformative for the British side. For the first time since the Desert War began, the 8th Army was fighting close enough to Alexandria and the Nile Delta supply base to receive reinforcements and materiel at a rate that simply couldn't be sustained anywhere further west. Every kilometer of retreat had cost the British not just ground, but logistics, longer supply lines, smaller forward stocks, greater vulnerability. Here, at El Alamein, the line was roughly 90 kilometers from Alexandria. Rommel's supply line, by contrast, ran back 800 kilometers or more to Benghazi, and beyond that to Tripoli, across a Mediterranean corridor that was becoming increasingly dangerous. Distance is not a neutral factor in warfare. Distance costs fuel, time, and men, and in the desert, distance killed engines with reliability. The railway halt of El Alamein, which gave the battle its name, was before the war a minor stop on the Alexandria to Mersa Matruh coastal line, used primarily for the movement of fish from the local fishing settlements. This is a detail I encountered almost accidentally in a pre-war Egyptian Railways Administration document that surfaced in a footnote reference, and I've found it oddly clarifying ever since. The strategic pivot of the entire North African campaign, the position that would determine whether Cairo fell, whether the Suez Canal was lost, whether the Allied war effort in the Middle East survived. This position was named after a fish market railway stop. The scale of what was decided here is almost comically disproportionate to the ordinariness of the place. By August of 1942, Montgomery had been given the army and the position. He had the geological wall on his southern flank. He had the railway line feeding his logistics. What he didn't yet have was the supply advantage, the intelligence advantage, or the army's belief that it could win. Each of those three things would have to be built from scratch in the weeks before October. But sitting with the engineering surveys and the operational diaries from this period, the thing that impresses me most is the simplicity of the initial fact. 64 kilometers of corridor, flanked by the sea on the north and geology on the south, roughly 90 kilometers from the nearest major Allied supply base. Those numbers defined everything that followed. Rommel walked into a room with one door, and the British closed it. There is a notation in a Middle East Forces Geographical Survey report from earlier in 1942. The specific reference involves a topographical cross-section of the depression's northern edge that contains, in the margin beside the bearing capacity calculations, the annotation: salt crust surface, vehicle penetration, impossible, no bypass. 3 words in the last sentence. 2 of them are a full stop on Rommel's philosophy of war. The survey officer who wrote them probably had no sense that he was composing a strategic verdict. He was doing soil science. And yet, when I read those 3 words alongside everything else that happened between July and November of 1942, they feel less like a technical annotation and more like a sentence passed by the earth itself. The desert did not favor Rommel. That had to be established before anything else could begin. Chapter 2. The Starving Army. The 15th of October, 1942. In a ruled notebook somewhere within the Italian Commando Supremo Supply Directorate in Rome, a logistics officer is completing a day's tally of cargo manifests for North African convoys. The figures are entered in pencil, each day's count initialed by the duty officer, each column cross-referenced against the previous week's returns. It is administrative work, largely invisible to the history books, and it carries within it the clearest possible signal of how the Battle of El Alamein was already being decided before a single British gun opened fire. The tanker columns show scheduled departures. The arrival column, for several of the most important entries, is blank. Beside 2 of the blanks, a different clerk has written a single Italian word in a different pen. Affondata. Sunk. The supply situation that Rommel inherited as he rebuilt his defenses at El Alamein through September and October of 1942 was not simply difficult. It was, in the language of his own quartermaster returns, catastrophic in a specific, measurable, documented way. The Panzer Armee Africa required a minimum of roughly 60,000 tons of supplies per month to maintain operational readiness in Egypt: ammunition, food, vehicle parts, and above all, fuel. In October of 1942, the actual total delivered to North African ports was approximately 18,400 tons, less than 31% of the minimum threshold. Of that fraction, a substantial proportion was ammunition rather than fuel, which meant that Rommel's vehicles were being maintained at a combat state they would not be able to sustain the moment they began moving. The shortfall was not a bad month. It was the structural condition of a supply chain that was being systematically destroyed from above and below the Mediterranean surface. The mechanism of that destruction was British intelligence, operating through a cryptanalytic advantage that Rommel never identified, and that the wider world would not learn about for another 3 decades. At the Government Code and Cipher School at Bletchley Park in Buckinghamshire, analysts working on what they called the Chaffinch key, a Luftwaffe Enigma variant used in North Africa, were producing a continuous stream of intelligence about Axis shipping movements in the Mediterranean. With rare exceptions, the intelligence identified supply ships by name, routing, and cargo. This allowed RAF Malta-based strike aircraft, primarily Bristol Beaufighters and Wellington torpedo bombers, to be directed against convoys with a precision that their Axis adversaries attributed, variously, to air reconnaissance, agent networks, and betrayal within the Italian Navy. It was none of those things. It was mathematics and patience in a converted Victorian mansion in the English countryside. In October of 1942, the tanker Proserpina was carrying desperately needed aviation and vehicle fuel for the Panzer Army. Ultra decrypts at Bletchley Park identified the Proserpina by name, cargo, and routing. Winston Churchill personally forwarded the identification to the Royal Air Force within 24 hours. Both the Proserpina and a second tanker, the Louisiano, were sunk. The fuel they carried, enough by contemporary estimates to sustain approximately 3 operational days for the Afrika Korps, went to the bottom of the Mediterranean. When I cross-reference this event with Rommel's quartermaster returns for late October, the connection is almost physically visible in the documents. A supply line that was already below minimum threshold lost 2 of its most critical individual shipments in a single day. By the 25th of October, the Panzer Army's own internal fuel assessment recorded a total of 3 days' supply remaining for the entire force, and crucially, only 2 days' worth were east of Tobruk, meaning actually deliverable to the front. Rommel's persistent and posthumously published complaints about Italian logistical incompetence deserve scrutiny here. because the archival record doesn't entirely support his case. Italian Commando Supremo records show consistent efforts to dispatch supply convoys throughout the autumn of 1942. The convoys were being dispatched. They were being sunk. The gap between Rommel's perception, Italian failure, and the documented reality, Allied interdiction guided by intelligence, is itself a significant historical fact. He could not know that his supply chain was being read. He could not understand why ships kept disappearing. So he did what frustrated commanders often do. He blamed the ally he couldn't control rather than the enemy he couldn't see. It is a human response. It is also a profoundly inaccurate assessment of his actual situation. The two North African port facilities that served as Rommel's primary supply nodes, Benghazi and Tobruk, were both operating at well below theoretical capacity in October of 1942 due to sustained Allied bombing campaigns. Benghazi, which could theoretically handle around 3,000 tons of supplies daily, was averaging fewer than 700 tons per day in October because of crater damage and dock destruction. Tobruk was operating at similarly reduced rates. Every ton that failed to clear the docks compounded the next day's shortfall in a mathematical cascade that no operational brilliance could interrupt. Even supplies that survived the Mediterranean crossing were accumulating at dock facilities that couldn't process them quickly enough. The system was failing at every node simultaneously. When I was reading through the logistics analysis compiled by British intelligence from captured German quartermaster documents, a body of material that doesn't receive much attention in the popular histories, I found it striking how thoroughly the supply picture had been understood on the Allied side. The 8th Army's intelligence staff, receiving ultra-derived summaries through their Special Liaison Unit, had an accurate picture of Rommel's fuel state that was in some respects more current than Rommel's own. Montgomery knew, before the battle opened on the 23rd of October, that the Panzer Armee was operating on a fuel reserve measured in days rather than weeks. He knew that a prolonged engagement, the kind of 12-day attrition battle he was planning, would grind down an adversary who had no capacity to resupply. The intelligence didn't win the battle for him, but it confirmed every assumption on which the battle plan was based. The wider strategic backdrop to the supply failure is worth placing precisely. Throughout 1942, German strategic priorities were oriented overwhelmingly toward the Eastern Front, where the summer offensive, Operation Blue, had pushed into the Caucasus and driven towards Stalingrad. North Africa received what remained after the Eastern Front's enormous appetite had been satisfied. Rommel submitted repeated formal requests to OKW, the Armed Forces High Command in Berlin, for reinforced supply allocations. The requests were acknowledged and largely unfulfilled. This was not bureaucratic incompetence. It was a rational prioritization of a theater that Hitler considered secondary. Rommel was fighting a campaign that his own high command considered a sideshow, with the supply allocations to match. The human texture of the supply failure is most visible at the unit level, in the reports from individual formations rather than the quartermaster aggregates. A panzer regiment operating on reduced fuel rations doesn't simply slow down. It changes its entire tactical posture. Movement must be rationed. Counterattacks must be planned, not around tactical opportunity, but around fuel availability. Training exercises stop. Vehicles are cannibalized to keep others running. The men know. Supply shortages aren't abstract to the crews who have to calculate how far their tank can travel before it stops permanently. By October of 1942, the Afrika Korps was a force that had been technically starved for months, and the men in it were aware of it in a way that no official document quite captures, but that runs through the unit diaries as a constant, low-register anxiety. The document that stays with me from this chapter of the research isn't an ultra-decrypt or a quartermaster return. It is an Italian supply ledger page, the kind of administrative record that historians rarely examine in detail because it feels too mundane for narrative purpose. With that single word beside two ship names, affondata, sunk. The clerk who wrote it was recording a logistical failure, nothing more. He didn't know that those two blank arrival columns represented the visible edge of an intelligence system that was methodically dismantling the Panzer Army's ability to fight. He was just keeping the books. But the books, read from this distance, tell the full story of how a battle fought in a coastal desert corridor was actually being decided in cipher rooms, on convoy routes, and in the cold water of the Mediterranean. The guns opened on the 23rd of October. The battle had been underway for months. Chapter 3. Montgomery arrives. The 13th of August, 1942, a transport aircraft lands at an airfield in the Egyptian Delta, carrying a lieutenant general from Britain who has not been in North Africa before, who has not met most of the officers he is about to command, and who, within 24 hours of landing, will have reorganized the command structure, canceled the withdrawal plans, and addressed the senior officers of an army that has spent the better part of 2 years learning to expect defeat. The heat at midday in the Delta in August sits well above 40 degrees Celsius. The dust is constant and fine. Bernard Montgomery steps off the aircraft in his characteristic way, unhurried, precise, already observing. He is 54 years old. He has not slept well on the flight from London. He doesn't say so, because he doesn't say things like that. There is a diary entry from this period, recorded by Brigadier Charles Richardson, a planning officer on the 8th Army staff, that I keep returning to because of its economy. Richardson wrote, on or around the day of Montgomery's first address to his senior officers, that the new Army commander spoke for roughly 20 minutes without notes, that everyone was listening, and that it was the first time I've seen the men look at a general like that. No analysis, no explanation, just the observation, written in the slightly compressed style of a man who was used to writing quickly. What Richardson was recording wasn't charisma in the theatrical sense. It was something more specific. The experience of hearing a commander who appeared to have no doubt. And in an army that had accumulated doubt like sediment over 2 years of tactical setbacks, that absence was electrifying. The condition of the 8th Army in August of 1942 has been described in various ways by various historians, and the descriptions matter because Montgomery's own post-war accounts are not entirely reliable on this point. His memoirs, published first in 1948 and then in revised form in 1958, present the army he found as being on the verge of collapse, demoralized and directionless, awaiting a commanding personality to restore it. Corelli Barnett, writing in the Desert Generals in 1960, challenged this picture directly, arguing that Auchinleck had already halted Rommel's advance, had stabilized the line, and had left an army that was tired and uncertain, but not broken. Barr and Latimer, writing more recently with access to a wider documentary base, generally support Barnett's revision. The army Montgomery arrived to command was not a shattered instrument. It was an army that had won a defensive battle and needed to be convinced it could win an offensive one. That is a different problem, and it is a problem Montgomery was uniquely suited to solve. His first formal act, the burning or cancellation of all withdrawal plans, was theatrical in its execution, but serious in its intent. Montgomery understood, with a precision that is visible in his planning documents from this period, that an army planning for 2 outcomes simultaneously achieves neither. The withdrawal plans weren't just contingency documents. They were a persistent institutional acknowledgement that defeat remained possible. Removing them was a way of removing the mental option. When he told his officers that the army would stand at El Alamein and die there if necessary, he wasn't making a military calculation in the conventional sense. He was making a psychological commitment on behalf of 195,000 men. The audacity of it, in retrospect, is considerable. The technical dimension of what Montgomery brought is less often examined than the psychological one, and I think that's a mistake. He arrived with a doctrine, call it the doctrine of balance and thoroughness, that was fundamentally different from the improvisational style that had characterized Desert Command on both sides for 2 years. Every formation was to understand its task completely before the battle began. Every logistical requirement was to be calculated and pre-positioned before the advance started. No phase was to be launched until the preceding phase was complete. The artillery was to be concentrated and centrally controlled, rather than dispersed in the piecemeal fashion that had weakened its effect in previous engagements. The training program he imposed on the 8th Army in the weeks between August and late October, at a point when Churchill was pressing for an immediate offensive, was not caution. It was the systematic preparation of an instrument that Montgomery had decided must not fail. Churchill's pressure during this period was real and substantial. From London, the strategic timetable was demanding results before the American landings in French North Africa, Operation Torch, which were scheduled for November of 1942. Churchill needed a British victory, achieved by a British army, before the Americans arrived and absorbed the narrative of the war's turning. He had already endured the public humiliation of Tobruk, falling while he sat beside President Roosevelt in the White House in June. He couldn't endure another. The telegrams between London and Cairo in August and September of 1942 read, "Once you've seen them," as a sustained negotiation between political necessity and operational reality. Churchill pressing, Montgomery refusing to be pressed, and General Harold Alexander standing diplomatically in between. Montgomery's willingness to delay the offensive by 3 weeks against Churchill's preference was not a small thing. It was an assertion of professional authority against the most powerful political figure in Britain. I find it difficult, reading Montgomery's planning notes from September of 1942, to sustain the simplest version of the genius commander narrative that he so carefully constructed in his memoirs. What I see instead is a methodical professional making a series of well-reasoned decisions under significant pressure, each of which was grounded in a clear-eyed assessment of what his army could and couldn't do. The battle plan for what would become Operation Lightfoot, the opening offensive phase, was not the product of a sudden inspiration. It was the result of weeks of analysis, rehearsal, and revision, drawing on intelligence about Rommel's position and supply state, engineering assessments of the Minefield system, and artillery planning of a precision and scale that hadn't been attempted in the desert before. The word masterpiece, that tends to attach itself to El Alamein, is arguably warranted, but not because of brilliance, because of thoroughness. Those are different things. The physical presence of Montgomery in the Army's daily life during August and September deserves mention here, because it connects to something visible in the unit diaries from this period. He toured formations relentlessly, speaking to officers and men, asking specific questions about training and readiness, making his face and his expectations simultaneously familiar. This wasn't public relations in the modern sense. It was a deliberate application of a principle he had arrived at from his study of the First World War and its leadership failures, that soldiers fight better when they understand why they are fighting and what is expected of them, and that understanding requires direct communication from the commander, not filtered through the chain of command. By October of 1942, a significant proportion of the 8th Army had seen Montgomery in person. They knew what he looked like. They had heard his voice. They had a reasonable sense of the plan. This was, in the conditions of the Second World War, genuinely unusual. There is a fact about Montgomery's appointment that doesn't receive much attention in popular accounts, but which has always struck me as one of history's more significant accidents. He had been scheduled to command the First Army for Operation Torch, the North African landings, not the 8th Army. The appointment to the desert came only because Lieutenant General William Gott, who had been named 8th Army commander, was killed on the 7th of August when his transport aircraft was shot down. Had Gott's aircraft completed its flight, the history of El Alamein might carry a different name. Whether Gott would have fought the battle as Montgomery did, with the same methodical insistence on preparation, the same willingness to hold Churchill at arm's length, the same psychological assurance, is a question the documentary record cannot answer. What it can say is that Montgomery's arrival at El Alamein was contingent on a death, and that contingency is worth holding in mind when the mythology of the event threatens to make it feel inevitable. By the end of September 1942, Montgomery had done the essential thing. He had built an army that believed it would win. The specific mechanism was a combination of psychological reconditioning, intensive training, and the replacement of officers he judged insufficiently committed to his operational concept. The material advantages, the tanks, the guns, the supply reserves, were being accumulated independently of anything Montgomery did. But material alone doesn't fight. The men who would walk into the minefield on the night of the 23rd of October had to believe, in some operational sense, that walking into the minefield was worth doing. Montgomery gave them that belief. How much credit he deserves for everything else at El Alamein is genuinely debatable. For that specific contribution, the reconstitution of an army's will, the record is clear. Chapter 4. The Devil's Garden. The 14th of October, 1942. Somewhere in the northern sector of the Axis defensive line, a Panzer Army Pioneer Battalion is completing its day's mine-laying operation. The work is recorded in a ruled notebook, in pencil. 3,847 Tellermine 42 anti-tank mines, laid in a specific grid sector, each day's total initialed by the duty NCO. The following day's entry, in a slightly different hand, shows a correction. the original figure scratched out, replaced with 3,614. Someone, in the middle of building one of the most extensive minefield systems in the history of armored warfare, was auditing the count. The Devil's Garden was being constructed with bureaucratic precision, one initialed entry at a time. The system that Rommel ordered built in the weeks following his defeat at Alam el Halfa in early September of 1942 was unlike anything previously laid in the Western Desert. The concept was not simply a minefield in the conventional sense, a belt of buried explosives designed to slow an enemy advance. It was a system of multiple interlocking obstacles, at minimum 2 parallel mine belts roughly 5 kilometers apart, connected at intervals by cross-belt fields to create enclosed boxes that would restrict Allied penetration and deny British armor the open ground it needed to deploy. Total mines laid across the Alamein front ultimately reached approximately 500,000, including a mixture of German Tellermine 42 anti-tank mines, older Tellermine 35 variants, Italian anti-personnel devices, and a substantial number of captured British mines taken at Tobruk. The defensive system ran from the Mediterranean coast inland for roughly 60 kilometers. From the air, it would have appeared as a faint geometric scarring of the sand. On the ground, at night, it was nearly invisible. The Tellermine 42, which formed the dominant anti-tank component of the system, was a steel-cased, pressure-activated device, weighing approximately 9.5 kilograms and requiring between 90 and 180 kilograms of downward force to trigger. A man walking over it, in theory, wouldn't set it off. A tank certainly would. But Rommel's engineers added a further refinement to many of the buried Teller mines. The Zündladung 35 pull-igniter, fitted beneath the mine body as a secondary anti-handling device. If a man found the mine by probing and attempted to lift it without first identifying and disarming the pull-igniter underneath, the secondary device would fire. The clearance technique, probe with a bayonet, feel the metal, grasp the casing, could kill the man doing the clearing. The Devil's Garden was designed not just to stop vehicles, but to penalize the act of removing it. The Italian contribution to the minefield construction is a dimension that often goes unremarked. Italian pioneer units laid a significant proportion of the southern sector, including the improvised tracking system that became one of the system's more insidious details. Using a long rope attached to a vehicle axle and a set of tires, Italian engineers dragged the assembly through the minefield in curving lines, creating what appeared, from above and at ground level, to be well-used vehicle tracks passing safely through the field. These false tracks were designed specifically to draw Allied vehicles into the killing zones. It was careful, patient, dangerous work, and it was done by soldiers who were simultaneously operating under severe water and food rationing in temperatures regularly exceeding 40 degrees Celsius. Between the two main minefield belts, the ground was not simply mined in standard pattern. Rommel had directed his pioneers to lay individual mines in no discernible sequence, randomized placement to defeat systematic probing. Each mine's position was recorded in the relevant battalion's register, but the information was deliberately not collated into a single master chart. The system was laid piecemeal by dozens of different pioneer units over several weeks, and the result was a defensive architecture that was genuinely difficult to reconstruct, even from captured German documents. There is a secondary consequence to this approach that I find worth noting. During the Panzer Army's retreat in early November, German forces would attempt to navigate through their own minefields at speed and in darkness. Having distributed the laying records across multiple unit registers, and with many of those records abandoned or destroyed in the chaos of withdrawal, they would in some cases have no reliable knowledge of where their own mines were. The trap they had built to stop the British would partly become a trap for themselves. When I was reading through the Royal Engineers' post-battle clearance reports from late November and December of 1942, I encountered a statistic that puts the scale of the Devil's Garden in terms I found genuinely difficult to absorb. The clearance teams, working systematically through the northern corridors after the battle, were lifting mines at a rate that they calculated would require several years of continuous work to complete across the full extent of the minefields. The 500,000 mines laid across the Alamein front represented, at an average weight of roughly 9.5 kilograms per Tellermine 42, approximately 4,200 tons of buried metal. Shipping, transporting, and laying that quantity of ordnance had consumed Axis transport capacity and fuel for weeks, in a theater already critically short of both. The Devil's Garden cost Rommel material he didn't have, to build a defense he needed, against an attack he couldn't prevent. The S-mine, the anti-personnel device scattered among the anti-tank mines in the northern sector, worked on a different principle from the Teller series. A buried cylinder with a pressure-sensitive trigger, it propelled a fragmentation canister to approximately chest height before detonation, killing or maiming personnel within a radius of roughly 20 meters. It was specifically designed to neutralize the infantry support that would accompany mine-clearing operations, the men who would normally provide fire cover while engineers probed the ground ahead. In combination with the anti-handling Teller mines, the S-mines created a clearance environment in which the two most fundamental mine clearance techniques, the systematic probe and lift of anti-tank mines and the infantry screen, were both directly targeted by different components of the same system. Montgomery's engineers knew this before they went in. They went in anyway. The numbers required to communicate the clearance task on the night of the 23rd of October are worth sitting with in their specificity. By the planning estimates of 8th Army engineers, each of the two main corridors to be cleared through the northern minefield needed to be approximately 24 feet wide and roughly 8 kilometers deep to allow armored vehicles to pass safely and deploy in good order west of the second belt before dawn. The standard mine clearance rate under fire conditions, using the bayonet probe and Polish pattern detector method, was roughly 120 mines per man-hour, less than half the rate achievable in training, because training doesn't include artillery fire, darkness, and the knowledge that the next probe might be your last. The men assigned to clear those corridors on the night of the 23rd of October understood, without needing to be told, precisely how much time they had and precisely what they were walking into. To me, the most revealing detail from this entire chapter of the research isn't in the engineering specifications. It's in a sentence from the 8th Army's planning documents for Operation Lightfoot, which describes the expected clearance timescale as sufficient to allow armored passage before first light on the 24th. That sentence, read alongside what actually happened, incomplete corridors, armor stacking behind the minefield at 3 in the morning, the command crisis that followed, tells you everything about the difference between planning and reality. The corridors were designed for a clearance rate that was theoretically achievable. The conditions on the night made that rate impossible to sustain. The plan and the ground disagreed, and it was the men with the bayonets who found out first. The Devil's Garden, as a piece of engineering, achieved something important, even in defeat. It slowed the 8th Army's breakthrough sufficiently that the entire battle became the 12-day attritional engagement Montgomery had planned for, rather than a 48-hour decisive action. Every day of delay extracted its cost in casualties. And here is what I think is the genuine strategic irony. Rommel built the minefield to create the delay that would allow his fuel-starved army to survive. Montgomery planned for a 12-day battle precisely because he expected the minefield to create that delay. Both commanders anticipated the same effect. Only one of them had the logistical capacity to sustain it. The mines slowed the British. They didn't change the outcome, they confirmed it. Chapter 5. The Spy Who Fed the Fox. Sometime in the late autumn of 1941, agents working for Italian military intelligence, the Servizio Informazioni Militare, conducted a covert entry into the office of the American military attaché at the United States Embassy in Rome. What they took was not documents, it was keys. Specifically, the cipher keys for the American diplomatic code, then known, within signals intelligence circles, as the Black Code, formerly the M138A strip cipher used for U.S. diplomatic and military attaché traffic worldwide. The keys were copied, returned, and the office left as they found it. The Americans didn't know. The British, who had been watching Italian intelligence closely, had suspicions they couldn't confirm. And in the deserts of North Africa, a German field marshal was about to receive the clearest intelligence picture any commander had possessed in the entire Western Desert campaign. Colonel Bonner Fellers was the United States military attaché in Cairo. He was by all accounts a thorough, professionally serious officer who did exactly what his government asked of him. He filed detailed, accurate assessments of British forces in Egypt and transmitted them regularly to Washington. His reports described British tank strengths, reserve positions, planned operations, logistics assessments, and morale evaluations, with a specificity that reflected genuine access and diligent observation. They were, in the terms of his assignment, excellent work. And because the Italian SIM had the cipher keys, German intelligence in Berlin was decrypting every one of them within hours of transmission. The summaries were passed to Rommel, who referred to the intelligence source as his gute Quelle, his good source, sometimes translated more familiarly as my little fellow. Between January and late June of 1942, Rommel was reading British mail. The operational consequences of this intelligence advantage were substantial and specific. Several of Rommel's most successful operations in the first half of 1942, including the movements that led to the fall of Tobruk in June, were planned and executed with an accurate picture of British dispositions and intentions that German field intelligence alone could not have produced. When Rommel appeared to anticipate British movements in a way that seemed almost preternatural to the commanders opposing him, the explanation was not genius in the mystical sense. Part of it was a diplomatic cipher that had been physically compromised in Rome and remained in active use. The gap between Rommel's apparent omniscience and the British commander's inability to understand how he knew what he knew was, in retrospect, explicable in entirely mechanical terms. The compromise was identified through what might seem an unlikely route. In July of 1942, a unit of the 9th Australian Division captured personnel and documents from the German 621st Signal Battalion, a mobile intelligence processing unit attached to the Panzer Army. Among the captured material were transcribed extracts of American diplomatic traffic that bore an unmistakable resemblance to cables that had been filed by Colonel Fellers. A British Field Security Service report, marked Most Secret and filed in July of 1942, noted that the captured extracts could only have originated from the American attaché in Cairo, and that the source of the German access had not yet been identified. The report's author underlined the words American diplomatic traffic twice and wrote in the margin, source not yet identified. It had been not identified for approximately 8 months. Washington was informed. The black code was retired and replaced. The Fellers intelligence window closed in late June of 1942, almost simultaneously with Montgomery's appointment and the beginning of the 8th Army's reconstruction. The timing is one of those historical coincidences that feel, in retrospect, almost architectural. The intelligence channel that had been feeding Rommel detailed British assessments snapped shut at almost the precise moment that Ultra began to be more systematically applied in the other direction. The polarity of the information war reversed, abruptly and completely, within a matter of weeks. What I find analytically important about the Fellers affair, and what I think the popular narrative consistently underweights, is its structural nature. Fellers himself had done nothing wrong. He filed accurate, detailed reports because that was his job. The failure was systemic, a cipher with compromised key material, remaining in active service for months after British concerns were raised, because the administrative and diplomatic process required to retire it and replace it with a secure alternative was slow. The mathematics of the M138A strip cipher were theoretically sound. Its security depended entirely on the physical security of its key material. Once those keys were copied, quietly, by hand, in an embassy office in Rome, the cipher was transparent regardless of its mathematical properties. It is a principle that remains fundamental to signal security. The algorithm's strength is irrelevant if the key is accessible. I spent some time with the post-war American documentation on the Fellers affair, and I want to be honest about what I found there, which is, primarily, reticence. The full scope of the intelligence compromise was handled with considerable discretion in official American accounts for decades after the war, partly to protect Fellers' professional reputation, partly because the episode reflects an institutional failure rather than individual misconduct, and partly because, as is often the case with intelligence history, the full story was only reconcilable with the ultra-secret, which wasn't publicly acknowledged until 1974. The British official history, particularly Harry Hinsley's work, is considerably more direct about the operational consequences. The discrepancy between the American and British treatments of the same event is itself a form of historical evidence about how Allied democracies manage politically inconvenient institutional failures. Rommel's own papers, edited and published after the war, contain almost no reference to his intelligence advantage. His analyses of his 1942 successes emphasize his tactical flexibility, his exploitation of British rigidity, and what he characterizes as the fundamental superiority of his operational concept. He never mentions the Güterquelle by its provenance. By the time he wrote his retrospective assessments, the source had been closed for years, and acknowledging it would have complicated the narrative of personal genius that the Rommel papers were, quite consciously, constructing. The intelligence advantage was real. The retrospective silence about it is equally revealing. The closure of the Fellers Channel in late June of 1942 matters beyond its immediate operational effect. It represents a shift in the underlying information environment of the North African campaign. A shift from a situation in which Rommel had near real-time access to British order of battle, to one in which, increasingly, the British had near real-time access to his. The transition was not instant, but by October of 1942, the structural reversal was complete. Montgomery's intelligence staff were receiving, via their Special Liaison Unit, ultra-derived summaries of Rommel's fuel state, tank strengths, operational intentions, and personal communications to Berlin. Rommel's intelligence picture, meanwhile, had returned to what conventional desert reconnaissance could provide: aerial observation, prisoner interrogation, and traffic analysis. The gap was not just quantitative, it was qualitative. One side was reading the other's mail. The question of which side had reversed in 4 months from one answer to its complete opposite. The detail that anchors this story for me, the one I find most useful for understanding what the intelligence reversal actually meant, is a specific ultra-decrypt from late October of 1942, which transmitted to 8th Army a summary of the Panzer Army's own internal fuel assessment. Montgomery's intelligence staff, reading that assessment, knew Rommel's precise fuel holdings in days of supply before the battle opened. They knew that a 12-day battle would exhaust what remained, that no significant resupply was expected, and that Rommel therefore had no strategic option except a static defense that would grind down to nothing. The battle plan Montgomery wrote was not a general's intuition. It was a response to a known situation, shaped by intelligence of extraordinary specificity. The fact that Rommel, fighting against that plan, never knew the source of Montgomery's certainty, never understood why his enemy moved with such calm confidence through a battle that should have been more chaotic, is one of the quieter tragedies of the entire campaign. Chapter 6, Night of the Guns. The 23rd of October 1942, 9:30 in the evening, across a 16-mile front in the Egyptian desert, 882 artillery guns are waiting. The crews have been in position for hours. The night is clear and cold in the way that desert nights become cold without warning, the temperature dropping sharply once the sun is gone. The stars visible with a precision that doesn't exist in European skies. The guns are positioned in their laid batteries, elevation set, ammunition pre-stacked beside each piece. The 4-hour artillery training shoot that had concluded earlier, a routine registration exercise to any Axis observer, has maintained the fiction of normalcy that Operation Bertram's months of deception had built. In a few minutes, 882 guns will fire simultaneously. The sound will reach Alexandria. The fire plan that governed the opening barrage of the 23rd of October is a 47-page document. I want to say that plainly, because the length of it communicates something that no description of the battle itself quite manages to convey. A 47-page fire plan means weeks of preparation, hundreds of man-hours of calculation, a level of technical coordination between artillery units, survey sections, intelligence staff, and engineering teams that represents something fundamentally different from the improvised gunnery that had characterized most previous desert engagements. On page 3 of that document, beneath the heading 0 hour, the time is entered: 21:40 hours, 23rd of October, 1942. According to the archive provenance notes attached to the document, someone added, in blue fountain pen, beside the typed time, 882 guns, all known, God help them. The handwriting was identified as belonging to Brigadier Sidney Kirkman, the 23rd Corps' Commander Royal Artillery. At precisely 21:40, the barrage began. The counter-battery phase, designed to suppress known Axis artillery positions before they could respond, lasted 5 minutes and 15 seconds, timed to a preset standard. The guns then shifted, in a coordinated lift, to a creeping barrage pattern, a moving curtain of shell fire advancing in 100-yard increments every 3 minutes ahead of the infantry of 30 Corps as they moved forward from their start lines. The technical achievement this represented was significant. It required every gun's precise position to have been established by survey, a process called survey coordinated fire, allowing the barrage to be superimposed on a common grid with accuracy sufficient for night operations, without direct observation. This wasn't standard practice in the Western Desert in 1942. In the previous years of fighting, desert artillery had often relied on observed fire, which was impossible in darkness. The ability to deliver unobserved, survey-controlled fire at this scale was one of the direct products of the months of preparation that Montgomery had insisted upon, and Churchill had tried to compress. From the German side, the picture was immediate confusion of a specific kind. General Georg Stumme, commanding the Panzer Army in Rommel's absence, was woken by the barrage and attempted to assess its direction and scope. The problem he faced was not the noise, but the width. A barrage across a 16-mile front does not point at a single objective. Every sector of the Axis line was being struck simultaneously, which meant that the Schwerpunkt, the main British effort, could not be identified from the initial artillery pattern. Stumme's communications with his forward divisions were already beginning to degrade. The counter-battery fire that opened the barrage was targeting Axis telephone exchange nodes and artillery positions simultaneously. Field telephone lines were cut. Radio transmissions from forward positions were fragmentary. The command picture at Panzer Army headquarters in the first hours of the 23rd of October was not incomplete. It was genuinely, operationally blind. Infantry from the 51st Highland Division moved forward with pipes playing. This detail appears frequently in popular accounts of El Alamein, usually as atmospheric color, the romance of Scottish tradition carried into the Egyptian desert. But it was a command decision, specifically authorized by divisional command as a psychological and noise discipline measure. The pipes communicated, through sound alone, that the advance was proceeding on schedule, that the plan was intact, the men were moving, and the darkness was not a problem. There were German artillery positions in the northern sector that survived the opening counter-battery fire and were firing back into the advancing infantry throughout the night. The pipes told the men around them that the advance hadn't stopped. It is a small thing, and it is also a large thing, and when I encounter it in the after-action reports, what strikes me most is not the romanticism of it, but the practical command intelligence it reflects. The Royal Engineers and New Zealand Division sappers, assigned to clear the mine corridors, moved into the fields at the beginning of the barrage, working under the rear cover of the artillery's creeping pattern. Each cleared lane was marked with white tape and hurricane lanterns spaced at regular intervals, enough light to guide vehicles, not enough to silhouette a man. The clearance technique used was the Polish pattern mine detector, combined with bayonet probing for the anti-handling secondary fuses. The standard clearance rate achievable under fire conditions, roughly 120 mines per man-hour, sounds, in the abstract, almost mechanical. In the practice, it involved lying flat on the desert surface, moving forward by centimeters, pressing a bayonet blade into the sand with controlled lateral pressure to feel for the curved metal edge of a mine casing, then working slowly around the casing to identify the pull igniter beneath before attempting to lift it. Men were doing this for hours, under fire, in the dark, while tanks and vehicles stacked up behind them waiting to pass. When I was working through the Mine Clearance Battalion reports from the 24th of October, the morning after the opening assault, I found myself caught by a detail that isn't in any of the operational summaries I'd read before going to the primary sources. The reports from the northern corridors consistently describe a problem not with the mines themselves, but with the false tracks. The Italian-laid vehicle impressions, dragged through the minefields with a rope and axle system to simulate safe passage routes, had been sufficiently convincing that at least some clearance teams in the confusion of the night initially followed them and found themselves off the planned corridor alignment in unmapped field sections before realizing the error and reorienting. It didn't cause a significant deviation from the overall clearance plan, but it added delay. And delay, on the night of the 23rd of October, was the one thing that Montgomery's schedule could not absorb. By the first light of the 24th of October, the mine-clearing operation was incomplete. The planned corridor depth of approximately 8 kilometers had not been achieved in either the northern or the southern lane. The armored divisions of 10 Corps, supposed to pass through the cleared corridors before dawn and deploy in good order west of the second mine belt, were stacked behind the minefields, unable to advance into uncleared ground without an unacceptable risk of tank loss, and unable to reverse without creating a traffic obstruction that would block the lanes entirely. Lieutenant General Herbert Lumsden, commanding 10 Corps, concluded that pushing armor into partially cleared minefields in darkness was operationally unjustifiable and ordered a halt pending corridor completion. Montgomery, informed of the halt at approximately 3 in the morning, disagreed with considerable force. The confrontation between Montgomery and Lumsden in the early hours of the 24th of October is one of the most revealing moments of the entire battle, and it receives less attention in popular accounts than it should. Montgomery, woken with the news that his armor had stopped, immediately contacted Lumsden and made clear, in terms that Francis de Guingand, his chief of staff, described as forthright, that the armor would advance or he would find commanders who would. He also informed General Alexander that he might need to relieve Lumsden before the battle was a day old. There is no gentle way to describe what he was saying, that the command authority of a lieutenant general would be overridden at 3 in the morning if that lieutenant general's professional judgment contradicted the army commander's operational plan. The armor moved. The fact that the armor moved doesn't mean the question was simple. Lumsden's halt order was defensible from the information available at his level at 3 in the morning. The corridors were genuinely incomplete. The risk of tank loss to mines was real and measurable. A reasonable commander, given incomplete corridor clearance in 2 hours until dawn, might reasonably conclude that a night passage through an unmapped section of minefield was more dangerous than a brief halt and a daylight assessment. Montgomery's counter-argument was not that Lumsden was wrong about the risk. It was that accepting the risk was necessary, that an armor force forward of the minefield, even at cost, was strategically essential in a way that outweighed the tactical calculus. Both positions had military logic. Montgomery had command authority. The armor moved. The opening barrage ended. The infantry was forward. The corridors were partially cleared. The armor was moving through the gaps, losing tanks to mines as it went, reaching ground west of the first belt in the thin light before dawn. 882 guns had fired their opening sequence and shifted to on-call support. From the Panzer Army's side, the picture was one of broken communications, incomplete defensive responses, and a command structure that had lost its general. Georg Stumme had driven toward the front at 6:30 that morning and had not returned. The battle had been running for less than 12 hours. It was already, in ways that neither side could fully see, becoming the battle that Montgomery had designed it to be. Chapter 7. The General Who Fell Off His Car. The 24th of October, 1942, 6:30 in the morning. General Georg Stumme, temporarily commanding the Panzer Armee Afrika in Rommel's absence, climbs into his command vehicle and drives toward the front. He has been awake since the barrage began the previous night. His communications with the forward divisions have been fragmentary. The counter-battery fire cut telephone lines across multiple sectors, and radio traffic has been intermittent and confusing. Stumme is not a man who makes decisions comfortably from incomplete information, so he does what experienced commanders sometimes do when the reports stop making sense. He goes to see for himself. His aide accompanies him. His driver takes the wheel. Behind them, at Panzer Armee headquarters, the operations log notes his departure at 0630 hours and records, with the neutral precision of military administration, that he has not yet returned. The operations log for Panzer Army Afrika on the 24th of October 1942 records his departure at 0630, and then, at 0815, a note that he has not returned and that attempts to reach him by radio have been unsuccessful. By 9 in the morning, there is no further contact. The log then shows something unusual for a military document of this kind: a gap. 2 hours in which no operations are recorded, no orders issued, no responses logged. The largest German-Italian formation in North Africa, 116,000 men, in the middle of the most significant British offensive of the Desert Campaign, had no commander. The entry that follows the gap is administrative. The silence in the record is the story. What happened to Stumme has been reconstructed from the accounts of his driver and from the physical evidence found when his body was eventually located. His vehicle drove into a zone of British infantry fire in the forward area. His aide was killed in the ambush. The driver, under fire and in control of a moving vehicle, accelerated to escape. Stumme, who had been grasping the outside of the vehicle, a common practice for commanders wanting to observe while remaining mobile, was thrown or fell as the vehicle lurched. The driver didn't know. He kept driving. Stumme was 56 years old, had documented chronic high blood pressure that his Wehrmacht medical examiners had flagged before his deployment, and was alone in the desert under conditions of acute physical and psychological stress. He died of a heart attack. His body was not found until the afternoon of the 24th. For the better part of a day, the Panzer Army fought without knowing who commanded it. The medical dimension of Stumme's death is something I find significant beyond its immediate narrative drama. A classified Wehrmacht medical assessment prepared before his deployment to Africa had noted that the combination of the desert climate, operational command stress, and his existing cardiovascular condition represented a serious mortality risk. He was deployed anyway because Rommel's illness had created a command vacancy, and there were few qualified armored army commanders available. The Wehrmacht made a rational institutional calculation. The theater needed a commander. Stumme was the best available option, and the medical risk was accepted as a cost of the assignment. The document acknowledging that risk and the document confirming his death are both in the archive. There is something quietly bureaucratic about that continuity that I find more troubling than dramatic. General Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma, the Afrika Korps commander, assumed de facto authority in Stumme's absence. But von Thoma faced an immediate structural problem that went beyond the shock of his superior's disappearance. In the German command system, the authority to commit major armored reserves to offensive counterattack properly resided with the army commander. With Stumme missing and Rommel in Austria, the chain of authority was genuinely unclear. Von Thoma could manage the defensive battle, respond to immediate threats, redirect formations within their existing sectors. A concentrated, theater-wide armored counterthrust against the British corridors. The kind of action that might have disrupted the mine-clearing operation before it was complete, required a level of command authority he was uncertain he possessed. He did not order such a thrust. He waited. The significance of that waiting is genuinely debated among historians of the campaign. German accounts tend to emphasize the tactical prudence of von Thoma's caution. The British corridors were not yet fully identified. The Axis armored reserve was split between the northern and southern sectors, and committing it prematurely against the wrong axis would have been catastrophic. British accounts, including Montgomery's own, imply that the 24-hour command vacuum was a missed opportunity that allowed the breaching operation to consolidate. The honest answer is that both arguments have merit, and that the counterfactual, what would have happened if Stumme had survived his morning drive, is beyond the documentary record's capacity to resolve. What the record can say is that the single 24-hour window in which German command hesitated coincides almost precisely with the 24-hour window in which British mine clearing made its most significant progress. Rommel received the recall signal while convalescing at his home in Wiener Neustadt, Austria. The distance from Austria to North Africa is roughly 2,400 kilometers by the most direct air routing available in 1942. He arrived at his forward headquarters late on the afternoon of the 25th of October, approximately 36 hours after the battle had opened without him. His arrival was announced to the forward formations and produced, according to multiple German accounts, an immediate improvement in morale. The name still meant something. The face still carried authority. Men who had been fighting without a commanding voice recognized the return of the one they trusted. What Rommel found when he arrived, however, was a situation that his name alone could not repair. His diary entry for the 26th of October is, in the original German, a document of contained despair. He records the supply situation as catastrophic. He notes 3 days of fuel remaining. He writes that he has no reserve, and that he must fight with what he has. The phrase he uses, "Ich muss mit dem kämpfen, was ich habe," is grammatically a statement of necessity rather than resolution. It doesn't read as the declaration of a commander who believes he can win. It reads as the assessment of a professional who has accurately diagnosed his situation and is choosing the only remaining option. I've read a great deal of military memoir and operational diary from this period, and that entry sits differently to me than most of them. It is precise, brief, and without illusion. It is the most honest thing in the Rommel papers. To me, the most revealing detail in the entire sequence of Stumme's death and Rommel's return isn't in the operational record at all. It is in the biographical footnote to Stumme's assignment. He had been court-martialed in 1942 for the unauthorized disclosure of operational plans by one of his officers, a serious enough charge to earn him a 5-year sentence, subsequently reprieved in order to fill the Africa Command vacancy. He was, in other words, a man serving out a professional reprieve, given one of the most difficult assignments in the Wehrmacht's order of battle as the price of his restoration. He died in his first engagement, in a desert ambush, falling from a vehicle he hadn't needed to be in, looking for information he hadn't been able to get by radio. The circumstances of his death are almost too specifically ironic to feel accidental, and yet they are entirely the product of coincidence and institution, not design. The operations log entry for 0815 on the 24th of October, not yet returned, attempts to reach by radio unsuccessful, is the kind of document that doesn't appear in dramatic reconstructions of the battle. It's too quiet for that. It is a duty officer's notation, written in the routine language of military administration, carrying within it the full weight of a collapsing command structure. An army of 116,000 men, in the middle of its most critical defensive battle, waiting for word of a general who was already dead in the sand a few kilometers away. The gap in the record that follows is 2 hours long. In those 2 hours, the British mine clearance teams continued working. The corridors got longer, the armor got closer to the western end of the minefields, and the Panzer Armee waited. Chapter 8. The Crumbling Strategy. The 25th of October, 1942. Montgomery's planning notes from September contain a sentence written in small, careful script, underlined once. It reads, in paraphrase, force him to use his tanks to save his infantry, then kill the tanks. The operational concept behind that sentence, what Montgomery called the crumbling strategy, is the least cinematic idea in the entire El Alamein story. There are no dramatic breakthroughs in it, no climactic armored charges, no single decisive moment that an editor might cut to. It is a method of systematic attrition, executed through sequential pressure on different sectors of the Axis defensive line, designed not to break through the front, but to hollow it out from within. It worked with the mechanical regularity of a process, rather than the excitement of a battle, and understanding it is essential to understanding why El Alamein ended as it did, rather than as a stalemate. The concept built on a specific understanding of Rommel's tactical psychology, and that understanding was more analytically grounded than it is sometimes credited. Montgomery and his intelligence staff knew, from ultra-derived assessments and from 2 years of documented operational history, that Rommel's defensive method depended on rapid armored counterattack to restore any penetration before it could be exploited. This method required, first, that the armored reserve remain uncommitted until the Schwerpunkt of the attack was identified, and second, that sufficient fuel exist to maneuver that reserve quickly once committed. By late October of 1942, both prerequisites had been substantially degraded. The fuel reserve was measured in days. The armored reserve was split between 2 sectors because British deception operations had prevented Rommel from identifying the main British effort. The crumbling strategy was designed to exploit exactly these conditions. Simultaneous pressure at multiple points, each one individually insufficient to justify committing the full armored reserve, collectively sufficient to force it to move in the wrong direction. The 9th Australian Division, under Lieutenant General Leslie Morshead, became the primary instrument of the crumbling operation in the northern coastal sector. From roughly the 25th of October onward, the Australians launched a series of sequential attacks against Axis defensive positions along and near the coastal road, not with the objective of a breakthrough, but with the objective of threatening the coast road itself, which served as Rommel's primary supply and eventually retreat route. Each attack forced Rommel to respond. Each response required armored units to move northward, toward the coastal sector to contain the Australian pressure. Each movement consumed fuel. Each tank committed to containing the Australians was a tank not held in central reserve. The Australians understood this arithmetic. They also paid for it. By the end of the battle, the 9th Australian Division's casualties from the entire Alamein campaign, July through November, stood at nearly 5,500, of whom roughly 1,260 were killed. The crumbling strategy was not painless for the instrument that executed it. The action at a position designated Snipe, on the 27th of October, became the most documented individual example of what the crumbling strategy was designed to produce. The 2nd Battalion, Rifle Brigade, occupied a forward position in the area of Kidney Ridge with 19 6-pounder anti-tank guns. Over the course of a full day, the battalion fought off repeated Axis armored counterattacks, destroying or disabling an estimated 57 enemy tanks and self-propelled guns, while sustaining serious casualties themselves. The 6-pounder, a 57mm weapon with a trained crew rate of roughly 15 to 20 aimed rounds per minute, was capable of penetrating the frontal armor of a Panzer III Ausf-J at ranges up to 1,200 meters. 19 guns, properly served, could put an extraordinary volume of penetrating fire into an armored formation in the seconds before it could close to its own effective engagement range. At Snipe, that is precisely what happened, repeatedly, across a day of fighting that the battalion's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Victor Turner, later struggled to describe in detail because he had been wounded 3 times before noon and had spent the afternoon operating on what medical personnel later described as pure physiological response. Turner received the Victoria Cross. He said post-war that he didn't remember much of the afternoon. What I find analytically significant about the Crumbling Strategy, and what I think separates it from simple attrition in the operational sense, is that it forced Rommel into a specific kind of decision loop that his command style was poorly suited to manage. His method had always been to identify opportunity and move faster than the enemy could respond. The Crumbling Strategy denied him both the opportunity and the response time simultaneously. Every sector was under pressure. Every sector demanded attention. The armored reserve that he needed to maintain centrally for the decisive counterstroke was perpetually being drawn toward whichever sector was currently most threatened. Rommel's war diary from the 26th through the 29th of October reads, in the passages available in translation, as a sequence of responses: northward, then southward, then northward again. Each response individually logical, each one collectively deepening the position from which there was no recovery. By the 29th of October, the combined German armored strength in both sectors had declined substantially from its opening figures. The 15th Panzer Division, which had entered the battle with 125 operational tanks, was reporting fewer than 50 by the end of October. The 21st Panzer, covering the southern sector, had been worn down similarly. The Italian 100th and 33rd Littorio Armored Division had been heavily engaged and was operating at reduced effectiveness. Against these losses, the British were pulling replacement tanks forward from reserve parks, a process that Montgomery had planned for and pre-positioned for in the weeks before the battle. Rommel had no replacement vehicles. None were coming across the Mediterranean. The mathematics of the exchange were doing exactly what Montgomery's planning notes had described. The tanks were being killed, one by one and in groups, against prepared anti-tank screens, in exactly the way the Crumbling Doctrine had intended. I want to be careful here about a historiographical point that I think matters for an honest assessment of the battle. Montgomery's post-war accounts present the Crumbling Strategy as a fully preconceived operational design, executed from the opening of the battle according to a fixed plan. Corelli Barnett, and more recently, Bryn Hammond have argued, with documentary support, that the crumbling concept was sharpened and refined during the battle itself, as the original Lightfoot corridor clearance plan encountered the friction of incomplete corridors and stacked armor. Montgomery's genius, in this reading, was not in the prior conception of a perfect plan, but in recognizing and articulating an adaptive response, as if it had been the plan all along, then executing it with enough force and consistency that the adaptation became indistinguishable from design. This is, to me, the more impressive achievement. A commander who executes a perfect plan that reality cooperates with is admirable. A commander who adapts a plan that reality has disrupted, names the adaptation, and drives it forward with unbroken authority is doing something harder. The human texture of the crumbling operation is most visible in the unit diaries of the formations that carried it out, not in the operational summaries, which inevitably smooth the daily reality into strategic narrative. The Australian attack diaries from late October describe specific terrain features, specific company strengths, specific times at which communications were lost and re-established, the specific problem of moving forward at night in ground that had already been fought over and was therefore disorienting in ways that virgin desert was not. Positions that had been held by the enemy the previous day now contained abandoned equipment, uncleared minefields that weren't on any chart, and the debris of previous engagements that made navigation by landmark unreliable. The men doing the crumbling were not operating in the clean conceptual space of a planning document. They were operating in ground that had already been fought over, in darkness, against a defender who was increasingly desperate and therefore increasingly dangerous. There is a specific detail from the Snipe action that I find worth dwelling on, because it captures something about the crumbling strategy that the operational summaries don't quite reach. During one of the afternoon counterattacks against the Rifle Brigade's position, a formation of German tanks approached the British line from an angle that briefly placed them between two groups of 6-pounder guns, crossfire geometry that hadn't been specifically planned for, but that the battery commanders immediately recognized and exploited. Several tanks were destroyed by flanking fire from guns they couldn't see. The tactical response was improvised within a framework of pre-positioned equipment and trained crews. That combination, careful pre-positioning enabling spontaneous adaptation, is the thing that the planning documents planned for but couldn't mandate. It had to exist in the professional competence of the men who were there. The crumbling strategy ended, as Montgomery had intended, not with a breakthrough in the conventional sense, but with the Panzer Army's armored reserve so depleted and so committed in the wrong positions that when the decisive blow finally came, it would find nothing capable of stopping it. The process had taken 10 days. It had cost the 8th Army roughly 10,000 casualties. It had cost the Panzer Army something closer to the entirety of its operational armored strength. Montgomery had told his planning staff in September that the battle would last 12 days, that it would pass through a break-in phase, a dogfight phase, and a final breaking of the enemy. He was right on all three counts. The crumbling strategy was the dogfight. It was brutal, it was methodical, and it worked precisely as described. Chapter 9. The Lumsden Crisis. 3 in the morning, the 24th of October 1942, 8th Army headquarters in the Egyptian desert. Montgomery is woken and told that the armor has stopped. The mine corridors are incomplete. 10 Corps' armored divisions are stacked behind the minefields, unable to pass through to their objectives before dawn. Lieutenant General Herbert Lumsden, commanding 10 Corps, has assessed the situation and ordered a halt pending corridor completion. The assessment is professionally defensible. The corridors genuinely aren't ready. The risk of tank loss to uncleared mines in darkness is real and calculable. A reasonable operational commander, given the information available at 3 in the morning, might reach exactly the conclusion Lumsden reached. Montgomery reached a different conclusion, and he communicated it in terms that Francis de Guingand, his chief of staff, described in his memoir as leaving no ambiguity about consequences. The 10 Corps operations log for 0300 hours on the 24th of October contains what is, in its specificity, one of the most revealing entries in the entire 8th Army archive from this period. The log records an instruction from Army commander to Corps commander to resume the advance, with the notation that alternative arrangements for command of 10 Corps would be made if the advance was not immediately resumed. This is not the language of operational advice. It is the language of command authority being applied at its sharpest edge, at 3 in the morning, in the middle of the most important British offensive in 3 years. Montgomery wasn't asking Lumsden to reconsider. He was telling him that his command existed conditionally on the next decision. The mine corridor problem that had produced this confrontation was genuinely complex, and I think that complexity is worth examining specifically, rather than simply accepting the post-battle narrative in which Lumsden is the obstacle and Montgomery is the corrective. By midnight of the 23rd of October, the northern corridors, designated Sun and Moon, running through the 51st Highland and 9th Australian Divisional sectors, had achieved approximately 3 2/10 miles of clearance against a planned requirement of roughly 8 kilometers of cleared lane. The southern corridor, running through the New Zealand Division sector, was at a similar stage. The armor needed a minimum of roughly 4.5 miles of clear lane to deploy effectively west of the first mine belt. The gap between what existed and what was needed was approximately 1 mile per corridor, 45 to 60 minutes of clearance work under fire, assuming the clearance rate could be maintained, which the preceding hours had demonstrated it frequently couldn't. Lumsden was halting the armor before a genuinely uncompleted task. The physical geometry of the armor's position made the halt dangerous in its own right, which is the detail that rarely appears in the straightforward account of Montgomery's decisiveness. Armored vehicles stopped in a 24-foot wide mine corridor at night couldn't reverse without hitting the vehicles behind them. They couldn't advance into uncleared ground without risking loss. They were stationary, in a confined lane, lit by the burning wreckage of vehicles already destroyed, and by the descending light of the full moon. The battle had been timed to the full moon specifically to facilitate the night clearance operation. A stationary armored column in a lane that narrow is an anti-tank gunner's ideal target. The decision to halt was therefore dangerous, but the decision to advance through uncleared ground at night was dangerous in a different, more precise, and less random way. Lumsden chose the less random danger and stopped. Montgomery chose the random danger and ordered movement. Whether either was correct, in the technical sense, remains arguable. The armor moved after Montgomery's intervention. Some units pushed through into ground that wasn't fully cleared. Several tanks were lost to mines in the passage. The corridor wasn't clean, but by the time the sun came up on the 24th, enough armor was forward of the first mine belt that the Panzer Armee was compelled to respond to a genuine threat. This was the operational outcome Montgomery had required. The cost: tanks to mines, disruption to corridor clearance schedules, the straining of a command relationship that never fully recovered, was the price of achieving that outcome in the time available. Whether the plan's optimistic clearance timescales had created the crisis in the first place is a question that Montgomery's own planning documents raise implicitly, and that his post-war memoirs do not address directly. The relationship between Montgomery and Lumsden did not recover from the 3 a.m. confrontation. Lumsden was eventually relieved after the battle, removed from his 10-Corps command in the aftermath of El Alamein, and not given another senior operational appointment in the Desert Campaign. Montgomery's post-war accounts characterize the relief as a necessary consequence of Lumsden's performance during the battle. Lumsden's own perspective, and those of several armored officers who served under him, suggest a more complicated picture. A commander who made defensible judgments under genuine uncertainty, and who paid a professional price for disagreeing with an army commander who had built his authority partly on the fact of his own infallibility. The truth, as with most such disagreements, is probably somewhere between the two accounts and irrecoverable from the documents available. I find myself, reading through the 10-Corps materials from this period, consistently struck by the specific problem of mission command in a fluid breaching operation, the tension between centralized control and subordinate initiative that the 3 a.m. phone call represents in its most compressed form. Montgomery's doctrine was centralized, methodical, and intolerant of deviation from plan. This served him extraordinarily well in the preparation phase of El Alamein, where the planning precision he demanded produced genuine operational advantage. In the execution phase, particularly in the first 36 hours, that same intolerance of deviation created the conditions for the Lumsden crisis. A subordinate commander making a locally reasonable judgment was overridden by an army commander who needed the larger plan to survive. Montgomery was right in the operational sense. Lumsden wasn't wrong in the tactical one. Both things were true simultaneously, and the command authority that resolved the conflict was blunt rather than subtle. The broader question the Lumsden crisis raises, and which historians of command doctrine have returned to repeatedly in the decades since, is whether the mine corridor clearance timescales in the Lightfoot plan were achievable under the conditions that actually existed on the night of the 23rd of October. The planned timescales were based on engineering rehearsals conducted in daylight, on unmined ground, without sustained artillery fire, at a clearance rate that was theoretically achievable. The night of the 23rd provided darkness, sustained fire, randomized mine placement in some sectors, the false vehicle tracks laid by Italian engineers, and the accumulated physical and psychological fatigue of men who had been keyed up for weeks for an operation they knew might kill them. The gap between the rehearsal rate and the operational rate was predictable. Whether it was predicted, and whether the armor's schedule was adjusted to allow for it, is a question the planning documents answer ambiguously. Herbert Lumsden, the general at the center of this crisis, died not in the desert, but in the Pacific, on the 6th of January, 1945, when a Japanese kamikaze aircraft struck the United States ship New Mexico during the Lingayen Gulf landings in the Philippines. He was serving at the time as the British liaison officer with General MacArthur's headquarters, a posting that represented, in the geography of the Second World War's command hierarchy, a long distance from the battles he had commanded in North Africa. He is one of the most senior British officers killed in action in the entire war. His death has no direct connection to what happened at 3 a.m. on the 24th of October, 1942. But I mention it because the 3 a.m. confrontation tends to define him in the histories, and the full arc of his service is rarely part of the picture. The entry in the 10-Corps operations log, awaiting clarification of authority, is the most human document I encountered in this entire chapter of the research. Not the fire plan, not the ultra decrypt, not Rommel's diary. This one. a duty officer in the middle of the decisive battle of the North African campaign, receiving contradictory orders from two generals above him in the chain of command, and writing, in the flat language of military administration, that he is waiting to be told who is in charge. He would have been aware, writing that sentence, of what was at stake in the corridors a few kilometers away. He would have known that armored vehicles were stacking behind incomplete lane clearances, that dawn was a few hours away, and that the outcome of the next decision was going to be significant. He wrote, awaiting clarification of authority, and waited. The clarification came. The armor moved. Chapter 10. Rommel's Last Gamble. The 26th of October, 1942. Rommel's forward headquarters, somewhere near El Daba. He has been back in Africa for less than 24 hours. He has driven to the front already. He has spoken to his divisional commanders. He has read the supply returns. He sits at his field desk, which is the kind of unromanticized item of military equipment, a folding table, canvas surface, perhaps a lamp, that appears in photographs of desert command posts with the anonymous functionality of all field furniture. He opens his diary and writes. The entry is brief. It records the supply situation as catastrophic, the fuel holdings as 3 days at current consumption, and his intention to fight with what he has. The last sentence, Ich muss mit dem kämpfen, was ich habe, does not read, in the original German, as resolution. It reads as necessity. There is a difference. The medical dimension of Rommel's return to North Africa is something that military historians have consistently struggled to address without sliding toward either melodrama or dismissal. He had left for Germany in early September, suffering from a combination of low blood pressure, chronic nasal catarrhal infection, severe stomach disorder, and what his physicians described as a general circulatory collapse. The accumulated consequences of 18 months of extraordinary physical stress in one of the most physiologically demanding environments in which the German military operated. His physician, Professor Horster, had recommended a minimum 6-week recuperation. He received roughly 3 weeks before the recall signal arrived. He returned to command an army in the middle of its most critical defensive battle, in a climate that his medical record had specifically identified as dangerous for his condition, with a supply situation that would have taxed a commander in full health. None of this appears in his diary entries in the self-pitying register. It appears only as context for decisions that were being made by a man carrying a significant physical burden that his command culture required him not to acknowledge. What remains genuinely impressive about Rommel's operational performance in the last days of El Alamein, and I want to be precise here because impressive and sufficient are different words, is the clarity of his tactical assessment. His diary entries and the surviving operational orders from late October and early November show a commander who understood exactly what Montgomery was doing and why, who could identify the Crumbling Strategy's mechanism and articulate it accurately, and who repeatedly attempted to respond in ways that were tactically coherent. The problem was not that his analysis was wrong. The problem was that every response option available to him had been pre-shaped by conditions he couldn't change. The fuel shortage that limited maneuver, the armored reserve that had been depleted by 10 days of attritional combat, the supply line that Ultra had been systematically destroying for months. His tactical clarity was being applied to a strategic situation that tactical clarity alone could not resolve. The sequence of armored commitment in the last days of October illustrates this with painful specificity. Each Australian attack along the coastal sector drew German armored units northward to contain the threat to the coast road. Each northward movement consumed fuel. Each tank committed in the north was a tank absent from the central reserve that Rommel was attempting to rebuild for a decisive counterstroke. His war diary from this period, in the passages available through the edited papers, records multiple instances of planned concentrations that were disrupted before they could be executed. A divisional counterattack prepared, then redirected to an emergency sector, then reformed in a reduced version that achieved tactical containment but not the operational effect he needed. He was playing a game of positional chess with pieces that were simultaneously being removed from the board. The Panzer Army's Italian formations deserve a specific mention in this chapter because they form part of the tactical picture that is often silently omitted. By late October, the Italian armored and motorized formations, the Littorio, the Trieste, the Ariete, were fighting alongside the German divisions in conditions of equal material deprivation, and were, in some cases, performing with an effectiveness that the official German accounts of the campaign consistently underrepresented. Rommel's communications to OKW from this period continue, in their standard register, to attribute difficulties partly to Italian inadequacy, a characterization that his Italian counterparts had been contesting for months, and that the documentary evidence from the Italian side doesn't support. The Ariete Armored Division, in particular, was still operational and combat effective in early November, when it transmitted its last radio message to Rommel's headquarters. The message was recorded in the German war diary. It said, in effect, that the Ariete was surrounded by superior forces and was fighting to the last. Rommel's diary note acknowledging the message records that they had fought with extraordinary gallantry. The recognition, having arrived after years of contempt, was neither sufficient nor untrue. Hitler's intervention on the 2nd of November, the order that instructed Rommel to hold the El Alamein position and offer his troops no other road than that to victory or death, is one of the most documented command failures in German operational history, and I don't want to spend more time on it than it deserves. What it cost, concretely, is measurable. Roughly 36 hours of delay before the withdrawal was finally authorized, during which the Panzer Armee was continuing to sustain losses in a position that was already strategically hopeless. The estimated additional casualties from the delay are in the thousands. The Italian non-motorized infantry, the Bologna, Brescia, Trento, and Folgore divisions, had no motorized transport for withdrawal, and the delay in the retreat order meant that even the improvised transport solutions that might have moved some of them were no longer available by the time the retreat was authorized. They were left. Not surrendered. Left. I want to say something direct about the standard Rommel mythology, and where the El Alamein evidence fits within it, or rather, where it doesn't. The Desert Fox narrative, which Rommel himself helped construct and which his posthumously published papers substantially reinforced, presents a commander of near supernatural tactical sensitivity whose defeats were attributable to the material failures of his allies and the indifference of his high command, rather than to any failure of his own judgment or method. The El Alamein evidence supports some of this. The supply failure was real. OKW's prioritization of the Eastern Front was real. The Italian logistical performance had genuine weaknesses, but the evidence also supports a parallel reading, that Rommel's operational method, built for movement, improvisation, and exploitation of enemy confusion, was structurally unsuited to the kind of deep defensive battle that El Alamein had become, that his habit of personally driving into danger had cost him a deputy on the 24th of October, and would eventually cost him his own health and clarity of judgment, and that his persistent framing of Italian failures as a primary cause of his difficulties was both professionally unfair and analytically incorrect, a convenient explanation that displaced the more uncomfortable one. Rommel's physical deterioration through the battle is not a marginal detail. It is operational fact. Commanders make decisions under physical stress differently from commanders at rest, and the German command culture of the Second World War actively discouraged acknowledgement of physical limitation. The men around Rommel knew he wasn't well. The documents that record their observations, in the cautious, circumspect language of men describing a condition they weren't supposed to notice, are among the more quietly revealing materials in the research archive. He kept driving to the front. He kept working through the night. He kept making the decisions that only he could make, because his command style had made the decisions dependent on his personal presence. It was a style that had served him brilliantly for 18 months. In a 12-day attritional battle fought on shrinking fuel reserves against a numerically superior enemy with better intelligence, it was the wrong instrument for the situation. The German war diary entry for the evening of the 2nd of November, 1942, records Rommel's decision to initiate withdrawal, the receipt of Hitler's hold-fast order, and the suspension of withdrawal preparations. The entry is written in the flat, administrative language that German operational diaries consistently employ, regardless of what they are recording. A commander ordering the retreat of a broken army uses the same grammatical register as a commander reporting routine supply deliveries. The diary doesn't editorialize, it records. What it records, in those November entries, is the systematic dissolution of a force that had fought with genuine effectiveness and considerable courage against an opponent who had been given advantages it could not match and could not overcome. Chapter 11. The Breaking Blow. The 29th of October, 1942. At 8th Army Headquarters, Montgomery is redesigning his decisive operation. The original plan, Operation Lightfoot's follow-through, driving the armor west through the cleared corridors, has encountered the accumulated friction of 10 days of attritional fighting, incomplete corridors, and the gradual repositioning of Rommel's armored reserve toward the coastal sector in response to the Australian crumbling attacks. The planned decisive axis is no longer the optimal one. The Axis defenses have shifted. The ground has changed. Montgomery looks at the map, looks at the intelligence assessment of remaining Axis armored strength, and changes the plan. What becomes Operation Supercharge will strike on a new axis, south of the coast road, toward the Rommel track, using the 2nd New Zealand Division's infantry to break the crust and the 1st Armored Division's tanks to exploit. He then tells Alexander, who tells Churchill, that the decisive blow will fall within 72 hours. Churchill, who has been cabling with increasing urgency from London, is given this assurance. Montgomery then sets about making it true. A handwritten note in Bernard Freyberg's planning file for Supercharge, the New Zealand Divisional Commander's own working papers, captures the moment with an economy that formal operational documents rarely achieve. The note records that the axis of attack has been changed. The new objective is the Rommel track, and that the armor will exploit the New Zealand breach. The final word of the entry, added in heavier pen pressure after the rest of the sentence, is a single word: again. Freyberg's men had been fighting continuously since the 23rd of October. They had taken significant casualties in the mine clearance operations and the infantry engagements of the preceding 10 days. They were being asked to make the deepest, most dangerous assault of the entire battle. The word, again, isn't a complaint. It is a notation of professional reality, written by a commander who was going to send his men into it, regardless. The planning timeline for Supercharge was extraordinarily compressed. From the decision on the 29th of October to the launch on the night of the 31st of October to the 1st of November, Montgomery's staff had approximately 48 hours to redesign the fire plan, reorient divisional boundaries, move artillery to new positions, brief the assault formations, and conduct whatever rehearsal was possible for an operation of this complexity. That it was accomplished at all speaks to the planning culture that Montgomery had built into 8th Army's staff over the preceding 10 weeks. The fire plan for Supercharge, 360 guns, a barrage similar in structure to the Lightfoot opening, but more concentrated across a narrower frontage, was produced and distributed in time. The formations were briefed. The assault went in at 0105 hours on the 2nd of November. The New Zealand Division's infantry, reinforced by the 151st and 152nd British Infantry Brigades, advanced on a 4,000-yard frontage into a corridor that needed to be 6,000 yards deep before the armor could follow. The assault cost 800 casualties in the night's fighting. That number, 800 men, in a single night's operation by formations that had already been in continuous combat for 10 days, is worth sitting with in its specificity. They cleared the corridor. By dawn, the lane was open. The infantry had done what the plan required, at a cost that the plan had calculated and accepted. The 9th Royal Tank Regiment's passage through the Supercharge corridor on the morning of the 2nd of November became the most costly single armored action of the battle. The regiment began with 94 operational tanks. By the time the charge had run its course, 42 had been destroyed, and additional vehicles had been damaged. The regiment's commanding officer, in his after-action report, described an engagement conducted in conditions of intense anti-tank fire from positions that the corridor clearance had not fully neutralized. British official accounts described the charge as a deliberate fixing action, designed to pin the remaining Axis armored strength in place for the follow-on exploitation by the 8th Armored Brigade. The regiment's survivors described something closer to a violent collision with a defense that was still, in its final hour, dangerous. Both descriptions are accurate. They describe the same event from different analytical distances. What I find technically significant about the Supercharge axis, the detail that distinguishes it from the original Lightfoot corridor approach, is the selection of the Rommel track as the exploitation objective. The track ran roughly north-south through the Axis defensive zone, and reaching it meant cutting across the lateral communications that connected the northern and southern Axis sectors. An armored force established on the Rommel track would simultaneously threaten the supply route to the northern sector and create an exploitation corridor running west behind the bulk of the Panzer Army's remaining infantry. It was, in the language of operational planning, a deep objective, one that, once reached, changed the geometry of the entire battle. Montgomery had identified it in his redesigned plan on the 29th. His armor was fighting to reach it on the 2nd of November. The final tank battle of El Alamein took place on the 2nd of November, near a position called Tel El Akakir, where the surviving elements of the 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions and the Ariete met the 1st Armored Division's tanks in open ground west of the Rommel track. The specifics of the engagement are recorded in both British and German after-action materials, and they tell a story of asymmetric exhaustion. The British tanks were fueled, ammunitioned, and reinforced from the reserve parks that Montgomery had pre-positioned. The German and Italian tanks were running on the last fuel, with depleted ammunition, in formations that had been in continuous combat for 10 days. General Ritter von Thoma, the Afrika Korps commander, fought personally in a tank during the final engagement. He was captured. Rommel, receiving news of the engagement's outcome, ordered the withdrawal. The order was delayed by Hitler's hold-fast signal. The withdrawal eventually proceeded. The scale of what Supercharge achieved in 48 hours is most clearly visible in the casualty and equipment returns. In the 2 days of Supercharge fighting, the Axis lost the effective operational capacity of its last armored reserve. By the evening of the 2nd of November, German operational tank strength on the entire front had declined to approximately 25 vehicles. Against this, the 8th Army's reserve parks still held hundreds of operational tanks. The disparity had moved, in 10 days of fighting, from roughly 2-1 in the British favor at the battle's opening to something beyond calculation. It wasn't a battle anymore. It was the final administrative stage of a decision that had already been made. To me, the most honest assessment of Supercharge's significance isn't in the operational records, but in the redesign itself. Montgomery built a plan, Lightfoot, that was theoretically sound and practically imperfect. When the practice diverged from the theory, he didn't insist on the theory. He built a new plan, Supercharge, on the evidence of what the ground had actually produced, rather than what the planning documents had predicted. He did this under political pressure, under casualty pressure, and under the time pressure of a battle that couldn't afford another 10 days of crumbling without result. The plan held together. The corridor was cleared. The armor broke through. And when the transmission recording the final Ariete position arrived at Rommel's headquarters, the general who had built one of the most effective armored forces in the history of the Second World War wrote in his diary that they had fought with extraordinary gallantry and then ordered the retreat. Chapter 12. The Pursuit That Wasn't. The 4th of November, 1942. The Panzer Armee is withdrawing. The coastal road, the Via Balbia, is crowded with the retreating columns of the motorized German divisions, moving west in the thin, early light, leaving behind them the non-motorized Italian infantry, who have no vehicles for the retreat. The British armored formations, which have been fighting for 12 days through minefields and defensive lines and counterattacks, are positioned to pursue. The road runs west across 1,500 kilometers of North African coast to Tunisia. If the pursuit closes that road in the next 48 hours, the Panzer Armee doesn't reach Tunisia. The arithmetic is simple. The execution is not. The 10 Corps signals log for 0745 on the 4th of November, 1942, records a request from a forward armored brigade for clarification. Should the formation pursue toward Fuka, the natural choke point 50 kilometers west along the coast road, or consolidate on the current line? The pursuit order from 8th Army headquarters is logged as received at 11:20 hours, 3 hours and 35 minutes after the initial request. The Panzer Armee's motorized columns had been moving since before dawn. The arithmetic of that gap, 3 hours and 35 minutes, at the average movement rate of retreating motorized columns on a metalled road, is something I find consistently difficult to set aside when I read the standard accounts of why the pursuit failed. The logistical argument for the delayed pursuit is real and deserves to be stated accurately. The 8th Army's supply system had been constructed specifically for a static offensive battle. Large pre-positioned stockpiles, a logistics chain oriented west along fixed supply routes, an ammunition consumption profile calculated for 12 days of intensive fighting at known rates. By the 4th of November, most of the forward ammunition stocks had been used. Fuel for armored pursuit operations had to be trucked forward along roads that were still partially mined and heavily congested with the debris of 12 days of combat. The 8th Army's real logistical constraint was not total fuel holdings, but delivery rate, the capacity of the forward logistics system to supply moving armored columns at pursuit speed. This constraint was a structural feature of how the battle had been planned and supplied, and it was genuine. It meant that the pursuit, whatever its operational intent, was going to be slower than the retreating columns, regardless. The possible cutting-off position at Fuka deserves specific attention because it is the tactical crux of the pursuit failure argument. Fuka is a point on the coastal road, approximately 50 kilometers west of El Alamein, where the terrain compresses. The desert hills approach the coast road closely enough that a force established across the road and its limited inland bypass routes would theoretically have blocked the retreating Panzer Army's motorized columns. Had a British armored formation reached and held Fuka before the retreating columns passed through it, the motorized Afrika Korps would have been trapped between the pursuing 8th Army and the blocking force. This is the counterfactual on which the pursuit failure argument rests. The documented fact is that no blocking force reached Fuka in time. The retreating columns passed through. The operational opportunity, to the extent it existed, was not taken. Whether it was genuinely available, whether the logistical constraints and the post-battle command structure were actually capable of delivering a blocking force to Fuka before the retreating columns passed, is where the historical debate becomes genuinely complex rather than simply accusatory. Field Marshal Michael Carver, who commanded a brigade at El Alamein and became one of the battle's most analytically rigorous post-war historians, argued that the pursuit failure was primarily a command failure, that Montgomery's corps commanders had been trained to maintain administrative order before exploiting opportunity, and that this orientation, appropriate to the set-piece battle, was exactly wrong for the fluid operations that a successful breakthrough demanded. John Latimer, writing in 2002, reaches a similar judgment. Montgomery's defenders, including David Fraser and Francis de Guingand, emphasize the logistical constraints. The documentary record supports both positions at different analytical levels, and I don't think the debate has been conclusively resolved by any single historian. The Italian non-motorized infantry left at El Alamein, as the motorized German divisions withdrew, represent the most human dimension of the pursuit failure's consequences. The Bologna, Brescia, and Trento infantry divisions had no vehicles for the retreat. They were not ordered to surrender. They were left in place, in their defensive positions, as the motorized columns moved west past them. They continued to fight with what they had remaining. Some were captured only after running out of ammunition. Approximately 30,000 Axis prisoners were taken in the immediate aftermath of the battle, the majority of them Italian. The capture returns in the British operational documents are recorded with the flat administrative precision that military documents use for everything. But behind each aggregate number is a specific formation, a specific position, specific men who had been fighting for 10 days in conditions of severe material deprivation, and who were now prisoners because their allies had the vehicles and they didn't. The rain arrived on the 6th of November, 1942, a heavy Mediterranean storm that turned the desert tracks into mud and reduced visibility to near zero. The pursuing British armored formations, which had been moving west along routes parallel to the coastal road in an attempt to outflank the retreating columns, were effectively halted by conditions that the vehicles couldn't manage. Rommel's columns, moving on the metalled Via Balbia, were less affected. The rain, arriving at the precise moment when a British interception might still have been possible in the southern desert, was not a planned element of Rommel's escape. It was weather. But weather, in a pursuit operation, favors the retreater over the pursuer, because the retreater has chosen the road and the pursuer has to cover the desert. The storm was 3 days of additional distance between the 8th Army and the Panzer Army, provided by a Mediterranean front that had nothing to do with either. I want to be direct about where this leaves the historical assessment. The pursuit failure at El Alamein is the strongest case available to Montgomery's critics, and it is a strong case. The 3-hour 35-minute gap in the signals log is documented. The failure to establish a blocking force at Fuka before the retreating columns passed through is documented. The rain is documented, but incidental. The logistical constraints are real, but in the view of several professional military historians, who knew both the documents and the ground, not sufficient to fully explain the outcome. What is equally documented is that Operation Torch landed in French North Africa on the 8th of November, 4 days after El Alamein's breakthrough, meaning that Rommel's destination, Tunisia, was already becoming a closing trap, regardless of what the 8th Army managed to do in the immediate pursuit phase. The Afrika Korps that escaped El Alamein survived until May of 1943, when it surrendered in Tunisia, along with approximately 230,000 Axis prisoners. The pursuit failure delayed that outcome by roughly 6 months. Whether 6 months mattered in the larger strategic arithmetic of a war that lasted until 1945 is a question each historian weights differently. Chapter 13. The Other Army. The night of the 29th of September, 1942, somewhere in the southern sector of the El Alamein line, near a position the maps record as Deir el Munasib, the 131st Queen's Infantry Brigade is attacking through darkness and across desert ground that the Italian 185th Parachute Division Folgore has been defending for weeks. The Folgore are parachute troops fighting as infantry. Their aircraft are in Sicily, unavailable. So they are defending on foot in conditions of severe water and food rationing, in temperatures that exceed 50 degrees Celsius at midday and drop sharply at night, with a water allocation of less than 1.5 liters per man per day. They have been here since August. They have reinforced their positions with what they could carry and what they could capture from previous engagements. When the British attack comes in, they hold. More than 300 attackers are killed or captured. The attack fails. The Afrika Korps War Diary entry for this engagement notes, without elaboration, the Italian paratrooper unit bore the brunt of the attack. It fought well and inflicted heavy losses on the enemy. This is how the Folgore appears in the German operational record, briefly, factually, and without the contempt that characterizes Rommel's broader commentary on Italian military performance. The British operational reports that were subsequently filed got the defending unit wrong. The reports attributed the defense to German Fallschirmjäger, German paratroopers, because the quality of the defense seemed, to the British officers writing the after-action accounts, inconsistent with Italian capability as they understood it. The Folgore's name did not appear accurately in British official accounts for years. They won a significant defensive engagement, held their line, inflicted heavy casualties on a well-equipped attacking force, and were written out of their own victory. The systematic misrepresentation of Italian military performance at El Alamein, in German operational documents, in British official histories, and in the popular narrative that followed, is not a small historiographical quirk. It is a substantive distortion of the battle's actual character, and it has persisted because the sources that controlled the post-war narrative had structural reasons to maintain it. Rommel's need to explain his defeats without acknowledging the structural supply and intelligence disadvantages he faced led him consistently to locate the cause of difficulty in Italian inadequacy, a narrative that was both professionally convenient and, in the specific cases it cited, often factually inaccurate. The British official histories focused on the German adversary because that is where the operational command interest lay. Rommel was the adversary in the British imagination, not the Italian commanders whose names rarely appeared in British signals traffic. The result was a population of military historians who inherited a substantially skewed source base and produced accounts that reflected the skew. The Folgore Division's material situation in October of 1942 is worth stating with precision because the precision is what makes their performance remarkable rather than merely notable. They were equipped primarily as light infantry. Their parachute training gave them exceptional physical conditioning and small arms proficiency, but almost no organic heavy weapons beyond what they had improvised or captured. Their water ration, officially 1.5 liters per man per day during the static defensive phase, sometimes less in practice, was below the minimum physiological requirement for sustained physical activity in desert conditions. Heat casualties were constant. Medical support was limited. Resupply by vehicle was intermittent because the southern sector roads were exposed to British artillery. In some forward positions, the Folgore were receiving supplies by camel because no other method was available. They remained operationally effective through October and into November of 1942. The Ariete Armored Division tells a parallel story in the armored role. The Ariete had been in continuous combat in North Africa since early 1941 and entered the El Alamein battle with equipment that was, by October of 1942, a generation behind the tanks being fielded by both the British and the German armored divisions. Their M1340 medium tank, the best vehicle available to the Italian armored forces in 1940, had been outclassed by 1942's models from all other combatant nations. They fought with what they had. On the morning of the 4th of November, as the Panzer Armee's German motorized divisions withdrew west along the coastal road, the Ariete was still fighting in its sector. Its last radio transmission, recorded in the German war diary, said that it was surrounded by superior forces and was fighting to the last. Rommel's acknowledgement, in his diary, of their extraordinary gallantry is accurate in its assessment and devastating in its timing. It arrived after 3 years. When I was working through the Italian unit histories for this research, a body of material that requires reading and translation, and that receives very limited engagement in the English language historiography, what struck me most was not the quality of the military performance, though that is genuinely impressive. What struck me was the consistency with which Italian commanders, at every level, recorded their awareness of being inadequately resourced and inadequately supported, alongside their continued operational commitment to missions they could see were beyond their material means. This isn't the behavior of an army that didn't take its responsibilities seriously. It is the behavior of an army that took them seriously under conditions that made serious performance extraordinarily difficult. The difference between those two descriptions is the difference between the Folgore, as written by their adversaries, and the Folgore, as they actually were. The supply differential between German and Italian formations in the Panzer Armee is a structural fact that is rarely articulated clearly in popular accounts of the campaign. Rommel controlled the allocation of supplies received from across the Mediterranean, and the documented distribution pattern consistently favored German formations over Italian ones, in categories including fuel, ammunition, vehicle parts, and food. Italian unit commanders made formal complaints about this differential through their own chain of command. Some of these complaints reached Comando Supremo in Rome, which raised them with German liaison officers. The complaints were acknowledged, and the allocation pattern continued. The Italian formations that are characterized in the standard narrative as insufficiently motivated were, in many cases, fighting with fuel and ammunition allocations that their German counterparts would have considered operationally unacceptable. The most telling detail I found in the Italian material isn't a combat statistic, it is a procedural one. When the Folgore's positions in the southern sector were finally overrun in early November, British officers processing the captured Italian parachutists noted, in several post-war accounts collected by Italian regimental historians, that the prisoners were in significantly worse physical condition than the German prisoners taken elsewhere on the front. Lower body weight, more severe dehydration, greater evidence of untreated minor wounds. The differential in physical condition between the Italian and German prisoners reflected the differential in supply allocation that had existed throughout the battle. The Folgore had been fighting at a disadvantage that was not of their making, and that their performance had consistently overcome. The British officers who noted their condition were observing, without necessarily understanding, the end point of a supply system that had systematically under-prioritized them for months. The legacy of El Alamein for the Italian formations that fought there is, in the long arc of the campaign's historiography, slowly being revised. Niall Barr's work, John Latimer's analysis, and a generation of Italian military historians have collectively produced a substantially more accurate account of Italian performance than the sources that dominated the post-war narrative. It is revision that is overdue, and that the operational record supports. The Folgore held their positions until they were physically overrun. The Ariete fought until its last radio transmission. These are not the actions of an army that failed. These are the actions of an army that was asked to do more than its resources permitted, that was denied accurate representation in the sources that shaped subsequent history, and that deserves, 80 years later, a different kind of sentence than it has generally received. Chapter 14. What Churchill Needed. The 29th of October, 1942, London. Winston Churchill is reading casualty figures. The battle has been running for 6 days. The Crumbling Strategy is producing losses without visible breakthrough. The telegrams from Cairo are professionally reassuring and operationally opaque, the kind of communications that expert commanders send to political leaders when they need more time and less interference, written in the language of confidence that is also the language of asking to be left alone. Churchill cables Alexander. The text, preserved in the Churchill archives, contains the sentence, "I am sure you are doing all in your power to bring this most critical battle to a decisive issue." The understatement is considerable. Churchill has been waiting 3 years for a British army to win a battle. He is now waiting in his office in London, reading casualty lists, not sleeping well, knowing that the political consequences of failure in the desert would be the kind that prime ministers don't recover from. The political architecture surrounding El Alamein is something that military histories of the battle consistently underweight, and I think underweighting it produces an incomplete picture of what was actually at stake in the planning and execution decisions. Churchill's position in October of 1942 was precarious in ways that the retrospective view, with El Alamein as a known outcome, tends to obscure. The fall of Tobruk in June had been announced while he sat beside President Roosevelt in the White House, and the humiliation had been both personal and national. A parliamentary censure motion in July had been defeated, but with a minority vote that Churchill found genuinely alarming. The North African campaign was not, for Churchill, a military problem with political implications. It was a political survival question that happened to be fought in a desert. The specific timing pressure that Churchill was managing in October of 1942 deserves to be stated precisely because it shaped decisions at every level from London to the Desert Command Post. Operation Torch, the Allied landings in French North Africa, was scheduled for the 8th of November, 1942. The landings would bring American ground forces into the North African theater for the first time, beginning a process by which the strategic narrative of the war in the West would shift progressively toward American command and American operational primacy. Churchill needed El Alamein to be won, demonstrably, publicly, with clear British authorship, before the Americans arrived and absorbed the strategic credit. This was not petty nationalism. It was a calculation about Britain's post-war political position relative to its major ally, about the terms on which the alliance was being constructed, and about what leverage a smaller partner retains when the larger partner takes over the fighting. Montgomery's insistence on delaying the Lightfoot offensive by 3 weeks, from the early October date that Churchill preferred to the 23rd of October that Montgomery had calculated as the earliest date his army could fight as the coordinated instrument he required, needs to be understood against this political background. Churchill's preference was not ignorance of military reality. He understood what Montgomery was building. He also understood the Torch timetable and what it meant for British strategic credit if El Alamein was still unresolved when the American landings happened. The 3-week delay was a professional judgment that overrode a political calculation, and it required Alexander to hold the space between them, absorbing Churchill's pressure, transmitting Montgomery's requirements, and preventing the political urgency from distorting the operational preparation. Alexander's role in this sequence is rarely given its proper credit. The public communication strategy around El Alamein, how Churchill managed the release of information to the British press and public before and during the battle, was itself an exercise in strategic political engineering. The censorship regime allowed enough information through before the battle to build public anticipation of a major action, while withholding specific tactical details and, critically, casualty figures during the fighting. The victory announcement, when it came, was framed with explicit deliberateness as a British victory, a Commonwealth achievement secured by British command and British planning. This framing was accurate in the narrow sense, and careful in the strategic one. It was designed to establish, in the public record and in the Allied political record, that Britain had delivered a decisive result before the American arrival, independently, with its own resources and commanders. Churchill was not misrepresenting the battle. He was narrating it in the terms that his political situation required. His decision to ring the church bells across Britain on the 4th of November, the moment the breakthrough was confirmed, was not unanimous in its reception. Several letters in the Churchill archives, from members of the public who were aware that fighting was still continuing, expressed concern that the bells were premature. The Axis still had formations in contact. The pursuit was only beginning. Churchill did not reply to these letters. He had made the calculation that the moment was more important than the unfinished details. The bells rang because Britain needed them to ring, not because the battle was over. It is a distinction that a politician understands, and a military historian notes. To me, what the Churchill correspondence from October of 1942 reveals most clearly, more than the strategic calculations or the public relations management, is the emotional cost of the waiting. Reading the cable traffic in sequence, the compression of the language is visible as you move from early October, when Churchill's communications are characteristically expansive and imperative, through the battle's first week, when the sentences get shorter and the reassurances more qualified, to the cables of the 28th and 29th of October, when the language becomes almost formal in its restraint. He doesn't say he is frightened, he doesn't say it might fail, but something in the register changes. The exuberance disappears. What replaces it is control, the very deliberate management of a man who knows exactly what failure would mean and is holding that knowledge carefully away from the page. The strategic significance of El Alamein's timing, its relationship to Torch, to the American entry into the North African theater, and to the subsequent Allied advance that would culminate in Tunisia in May of 1943, is something that the popular narrative occasionally acknowledges and more often elides. El Alamein is typically described as the turning point in North Africa, which is true in the narrow operational sense and somewhat misleading in the broader strategic one. The combined effect of El Alamein and Torch together created the double pressure that ultimately destroyed the Axis position in North Africa. Either operation alone would have been insufficient. What El Alamein specifically provided, and what Churchill's political calculation had correctly identified as essential, was a demonstration of British military effectiveness, achieved independently before the American operational contribution arrived and reshaped the alliance's internal politics. That demonstration cost roughly 13,500 British and Commonwealth casualties. Churchill knew the cost. He rang the bells anyway. The Italian memorial at El Alamein, the German cemetery, and the Commonwealth War Graves Commission cemetery stand within a few kilometers of each other, near the old battle site. The Commonwealth Cemetery contains 7,240 graves. Most visitors come for the beach. The new Egyptian resort development around New Alamein City is visible from the Memorial Road. The political significance of what was decided there, the specific calculation that Churchill made in October of 1942 about British strategic credit in American alliance politics, is not marked on any headstone. It exists only in the archive, in the cable traffic and the diary entries of a man who spent the most important week of the North African campaign in London, reading casualty figures, waiting. Chapter 15. The Intelligence War Beneath the Battle. Bletchley Park, Buckinghamshire, 1942. The building that housed the Government Code and Cipher School was a Victorian country house surrounded by wartime timber huts, each housing a different analytical team working on a different cryptanalytic problem. The work done in those huts was invisible to almost everyone fighting in North Africa. The men and women working there didn't appear in unit diaries or operational orders. Their names don't appear on the memorial at El Alamein. And yet the evidence suggests, when you read the supply intercepts alongside the shipping loss records, the fuel assessment decrypts alongside the quartermaster returns, that the Battle of El Alamein was substantially shaped by work done in a converted country house in Buckinghamshire, rather than by any decision made in the Egyptian desert. That is not an overstatement. It is the conclusion of the official British intelligence historian, Harry Hinsley, writing in 1981 with full access to the declassified record. The specific intelligence architecture at El Alamein had two distinct and connected components: the ultra-decrypts of Axis communications and the closure of the Bonner-Fellers channel that had been feeding Rommel detailed British order of battle intelligence through the first half of 1942. The combination of these two events, the source that had been feeding Rommel going dark, and the ultra-machinery being turned against him simultaneously, represented one of the most complete intelligence reversals in the history of the Second World War, compressed into a period of roughly 4 weeks in the summer of 1942. Rommel went from British mail to having his own mail read, without ever knowing that either had happened. The Chaffinch key, the Luftwaffe Enigma variant used for North African theater communications, provided the analytical teams at Bletchley with a continuous feed of operational intelligence throughout the autumn of 1942. The turnaround time from German transmission to British intelligence distribution, at its peak in late 1942, had been reduced to approximately 6 to 8 hours for urgent operational traffic. This meant that Rommel's own supply assessments, operational intentions, and communications to OKW were reaching Montgomery's intelligence staff at 8th Army headquarters, via the special liaison unit attached to the headquarters, within hours of being written. Montgomery's intelligence picture was not merely better than Rommel's. It was, in specific categories, more current than Rommel's own, because the German quartermasters were calculating the supply figures that Montgomery was reading before the Panzer Army's operational staff had finished assessing their implications. The sinking of the tanker Proserpina on the 26th of October, 1942, is the single clearest example of ultra-intelligence being translated directly into operational effect. The decrypt identified the tanker by name, cargo, and routing. Churchill personally forwarded the identification to the Royal Air Force within 24 hours. The aircraft found the Proserpina and a second tanker, the Louisiano, and sank them both. The fuel they were carrying, enough by contemporary estimates, for approximately 3 operational days for the Afrika Korps, went into the Mediterranean. Within days, Rommel's own quartermaster return would record 3 days of total fuel remaining for the entire Panzer Army. The connection between the decrypt, the strike, and the supply return is visible in the documents if you read across the different archive series. Rommel, reading only the supply return, saw a disaster he couldn't explain. The explanation was in the British intelligence files. The security protocols that protected the ultra-secret throughout the battle were maintained with extraordinary discipline and deserve more attention than they receive in accounts focused on the intelligence product rather than the intelligence process. Information derived from decrypts was never acted upon without a cover, a plausible alternative explanation for British awareness. Typically, this was a claimed aerial reconnaissance sighting, sometimes a reported agent network report. The cover story had to be credible enough that Axis investigation would not lead back to signals intelligence as the actual source. This meant that in some cases, a British air reconnaissance aircraft had to visibly overfly a convoy before a strike could be directed against it, even when the convoy's position was already known from decrypts. The management of this protocol throughout the Mediterranean campaign required constant coordination between intelligence, air command, and naval command, a level of institutional discipline that is, in retrospect, extraordinary given the pressures under which it was being maintained. When I was reading through Hinsley's official history in parallel with the operational accounts, the passage I kept returning to was his summary assessment of the Panzer Army's position, that it did not possess the operational freedom of movement that was absolutely essential. That sentence, written by the man who knew the full intelligence record better than any other historian, is the most precise available statement of what Ultra actually did at El Alamein. It didn't win the battle. It confirmed and institutionalized a situation that was already structurally lethal for the Axis. The intelligence advantage was necessary. It was not sufficient. Both parts of that assessment matter equally because the popular tendency, particularly since the ultra-secret was publicly revealed in 1974, has been to collapse the battle into an intelligence story, which misrepresents what the fighting actually cost. The ultra-secret's protection was so effective that Rommel himself never identified it as a factor in his defeat. His post-war papers attribute the supply failures to the Mediterranean convoy losses, which he explains through Italian naval inadequacy, Allied air power in the Mediterranean, and the general inadequacy of Axis logistics management. He is not entirely wrong in any of these attributions. All of these factors were real. He simply doesn't know that a Bletchley Park team reading his communications was the mechanism coordinating the targeting of the convoys, the directing of the airstrikes, and the maintenance of the pressure that kept his fuel holdings permanently below operational threshold. He died without knowing. The intelligence advantage that defeated him remained invisible to him until his death, which may be the most complete victory that Bletchley Park achieved in the entire war. To me, the most quietly significant aspect of the ultra dimension at El Alamein is what it reveals about the relationship between intelligence and command decision-making. Specifically, the question of whether knowing what the enemy will do replaces operational skill or merely raises the standard required to exploit the advantage. Montgomery knew Rommel's fuel state. He knew his tank strength. He knew, in broad terms, what Rommel intended. This knowledge enabled him to plan a 12-day battle with confidence that the Panzer Army couldn't sustain it. But knowing the enemy's weakness and converting that knowledge into a battlefield result required the artillery preparation, the mine clearance operations, the Crumbling Strategy, the Supercharge redesign, and the command authority to hold it together when the plan encountered friction. The intelligence told Montgomery that the situation was winnable. The battle demonstrated that winning it still cost 13,500 casualties, and 12 days of some of the most difficult fighting the Eighth Army had ever undertaken. The men and women who worked in the timber huts at Bletchley Park don't appear in the standard histories of El Alamein, because they couldn't at the time, and because the habit of omission persisted long after the secret was revealed. The analytical teams who maintained the Chaffinch Key, who processed the supply ship intercepts, who produced the daily intelligence summaries that went to the special liaison units in the field. These people were doing work of direct operational consequence, in conditions of intellectual intensity and institutional secrecy that defined the entire character of their war service. They knew they were important. They didn't know, in most cases, specifically how or where their work was landing. A decrypt that left Bletchley on a Tuesday morning might, by Wednesday afternoon, have directed a strike that changed a quartermaster return, that shaped a battle that changed the outcome of a campaign. The chain of consequence was real. The individual links in it worked, for the most part, in isolation from each other and from the eventual result. Chapter 16. Monty's Masterpiece? The archive shelf that contains the Corelli-Barnett research notes for the Desert Generals holds, among other materials, a handwritten page headed simply, Montgomery, Case Against. It contains 15 numbered points in Barnett's handwriting. Point 9 reads, in paraphrase, inherited the army, inherited the plan, inherited the terrain, inherited the intelligence, executed well. But executed well is not genius. Whether one agrees with the formulation or not, it is worth sitting with seriously rather than dismissing it as polemic. Because the honest historiographical question about El Alamein is not whether Montgomery won. He did, decisively, and at significant human cost. But what kind of victory it was, and how much of it reflects individual command genius, as opposed to systemic advantage that any competent commander would have exploited. That question has no comfortable answer, and the documents don't resolve it cleanly. The Auchinleck credit question is the oldest and most persistent of the El Alamein debates, and its persistence reflects a genuine historical injustice rather than mere academic disagreement. Auchinleck chose the El Alamein position, fought the first battle that proved the line was viable, and directed, through his chief of staff, Major General Eric Dorman Smith, the planning of the Alam el Halfa defensive scheme that Montgomery executed in late August of 1942 against Rommel's last offensive push. Montgomery arrived, reorganized the command structure, canceled the withdrawal plans, and conducted Alam el Halfa using a plan that his own staff later confirmed was substantially prepared before he arrived. Then, in his post-war memoirs, he wrote about Auchinleck in terms that were dismissive, sometimes inaccurate, and consistently self-serving. Barnett's 1960 account was the first major English-language history to document this directly. Neil Barr's work in 2004, using a wider documentary base, confirmed and extended Barnett's analysis. Auchinleck's reputation has never fully recovered from Montgomery's pen, which is a fact about post-war historiography as much as about the battle itself. The "could anyone have done this" question is, honestly, unresolvable. And I think acknowledging that it's unresolvable is more useful than pretending a verdict is available. The material advantage that Montgomery commanded at El Alamein was built by factors largely independent of his command. American Lend-Lease Sherman tanks, Churchill's supply priority for the theater, the Atlantic convoy system that delivered the materiel, the ultra-intelligence architecture that was already operational before Montgomery arrived, and the Qattara Depression that was there before any of them. Montgomery's defenders, David Fraser most articulately, argue that what distinguishes him is not what he was given, but how completely he refused to waste it. That previous British commanders had possessed elements of this advantage and had dissipated them through premature action, command friction, and insufficient preparation. The argument has merit. It also leaves open the question of whether what Montgomery had in excess of his predecessors was genius or thoroughness, or a specific kind of professional stubbornness that happened to be exactly what the situation required. These are different things, and the distinction matters. The pursuit failure remains, in my assessment, the clearest and most documented limitation of Montgomery's El Alamein command. The 3-hour, 35-minute gap in the signals log on the morning of the 4th of November is not a number I can explain away with logistical arguments, though those arguments are partially valid. The failure to establish a blocking position at Fuka is documented and consequential. That the Afrika Korps eventually surrendered in Tunisia in May of 1943, that the 6-month delay in its destruction was, in the final strategic accounting, a 6-month delay rather than a permanent escape, reduces the operational significance of the pursuit failure without eliminating it. Montgomery planned and executed the set-piece battle with extraordinary precision, and then, in the exploitation phase, reverted to a command style that was constitutionally unsuited to the fluid pursuit. His critics are right about this. The logistical arguments his defenders advance are also partially right. Both positions coexist in the documentary record, and neither fully explains what happened between the breakthrough and the Fuka bypass. The primary sources for El Alamein are themselves unevenly reliable in ways that matter for any honest historiographical assessment. Montgomery's published memoirs, the 1948 volume and the more comprehensive 1958 account, are documents that he shaped with considerable care towards specific ends, and reading them without cross-referencing his contemporary papers consistently produces a more capable, less improvised commander than the archival record supports. The immediate post-battle dispatches, written in the weeks after El Alamein while the events were fresh and the subsequent editing had not yet occurred, are more candid about the Lumsden crisis, the corridor clearance failures, and the pursuit's limitations than anything he published later. The Rommel papers, edited by Basil Little-Hart, are a more obvious case of post-war editorial shaping, a curated selection from an incomplete archive, organized to emphasize certain interpretations. The unit war diaries, required by regulation to be submitted unchanged, are the most reliably unedited primary sources for specific tactical events, and they are the documents that most consistently complicate the smooth post-war narratives from both sides. What the documents most clearly support, when read across rather than within any single account, is a picture of a battle that was structurally predetermined in its broad outcome. The material asymmetry was too great, the intelligence advantage too complete, the terrain too constraining for any other result to have been plausible, and genuinely contested in its specific daily execution, in the decisions made under pressure, in the adaptations forced by a reality that never quite matched the planning documents. Montgomery's genius, if that is the right word, was in refusing to allow the gap between plan and reality to become the operative fact of the battle. When the corridors were incomplete, he forced the armor through at risk. When the Lightfoot axis was no longer optimal, he redesigned it in 48 hours. When Churchill pressed for results, he absorbed the pressure and continued his timeline. Each of these choices was contestable in the moment. Each proved correct in the outcome. The accumulation of correct choices under pressure, sustained across 12 days of intensive attritional combat, is what the Battle of El Alamein actually demonstrates about its commander. Whether that accumulation constitutes a masterpiece is, ultimately, a question about what the word means. Chapter 17. What the Desert Decided. The 5th of November, 1942, Cairo. A letter written by a member of the British Embassy staff to his wife in London records, in a single paragraph, that its author probably didn't expect to survive, that the Egyptians were celebrating in the streets of the city, and that they were not celebrating a British victory. They were celebrating their own survival. There is a difference, the letter notes, and I find myself deeply moved by it. The letter is unsigned. It is filed in the Foreign Office 141 series of the Cairo Embassy records. It was written in the days immediately following the breakthrough at El Alamein, when the news had reached the city and the streets had come alive with a relief that was specifically Egyptian rather than specifically Allied. The city had been living, for 4 months, with the knowledge that the front was 90 kilometers to the west. That distance is roughly the distance from London to Oxford, close enough to feel. The strategic stakes at El Alamein are stated in military histories with a consistency that has made them feel, in retrospect, almost procedural. The Suez Canal, the Middle Eastern oil fields, the overland route to India. These things are named and moved past, as if naming them is sufficient. I don't think it is. The Suez Canal in 1942 carried roughly 40% of Britain's strategic shipping by tonnage. A hostile power controlling it would have doubled Allied shipping times between Britain and India and the Pacific, because the Cape route around Africa adds roughly 15,000 kilometers to every voyage. Middle Eastern oil, specifically the fields at Mosul in northern Iraq and at Abadan in Persia, supplied approximately a third of Allied fuel requirements in 1942. Rommel in Cairo and on the Canal would not have ended the war, but it would have altered its geometry in ways that the participants, looking at the map in the autumn of 1942, correctly identified as potentially decisive. The hypothetical consequences of an Axis breakthrough at El Alamein extend beyond the immediate military geography. British political analysis from July of 1942, the Ash Wednesday period, when documents were being burned at GHQ Cairo, included assessments of Egyptian political figures who had established contact with German intelligence and who were understood to be preparing contingency positions for an Axis occupation. The Egyptian political class was not monolithically pro-British. The British presence in Egypt was legally based on a 1936 treaty that many Egyptians considered an infringement of sovereignty, and there was a strand of Egyptian nationalist opinion that saw German victory as a potential path to independence from British influence. A Rommel in Cairo would not simply have been a military occupier. He would have walked into a political landscape that included active Egyptian collaboration possibilities, something that the British political officers of the period were acutely aware of, and that the military histories rarely mention. The story of what happened to the non-motorized Italian infantry left at El Alamein deserves to be part of the account of what El Alamein decided, because it is the human cost that is most completely invisible in the standard narrative. The Bologna, Brescia, Trento, and Folgore divisions, approximately 30,000 men, were left in their defensive positions when the German motorized units withdrew. They had no vehicles. The retreat authorization arrived too late for improvised transport solutions to save more than a fraction of them. They continued to fight with remaining ammunition, were overrun position by position, and were taken prisoner. The men from the Folgore, who attempted to fight their way out on foot across the desert, in November heat, with whatever water they could carry. Their march is documented in Italian regimental histories in detail that the English-language accounts don't replicate. Some of them got significant distances before being captured or collapsing. They had been fighting, without adequate supply, in a position their allies had made defensible and then abandoned, for months. Their story is part of what El Alamein decided. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission Cemetery at El Alamein contains 7,240 graves. Among them, across the Allied formations that fought there, are soldiers from Britain, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, India, Greece, and France. The full geographic spread of what a world war in 1942 actually meant in human terms. The youngest grave whose age has been confirmed through cross-referencing regimental records with War Office correspondence belongs to a private of the Royal Sussex Regiment, killed on the 25th of October, 1942. He was 16 years old. He had lied to enlist. His age on the headstone was not confirmed until his mother's letters to the War Office, querying his age at recruitment, were matched to the regimental files in the 1990s. He had been in the sand for 50 years before the record caught up with him. His name is on the stone. The date is there. The age is there now, confirmed. It is the most specific piece of information in this entire documentary, and I leave it here without elaboration. The battle ended. The church bells rang. The Panzer Army retreated 1,500 kilometers to Tunisia, where it surrendered in May of 1943. El Alamein took roughly 13 days from barrage to breakthrough, and produced approximately 68,000 total casualties across all formations. Churchill said, the phrase is documented, attributed to his speech to the Lord Mayor's luncheon on the 10th of November 1942, that this is not the end, it is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning. The qualification is typically read as modesty. In context, it reads as precision. Churchill knew exactly what El Alamein had and hadn't decided, and he was telling his audience not to misunderstand the scale of what remained. The modern town of El Alamein, or more precisely the new Egyptian administrative city being built nearby, designated New Alamein City, is a development of resort hotels, government buildings, and coastal infrastructure that sits adjacent to the old battle sites. The beaches are clean, the hotels are new. The desert behind them still contains, by most estimates, more than 17 million mines and pieces of unexploded ordnance from the 1942 battles, the legacy of the Devil's Garden, spread across ground that has been the subject of continuous demining operations since the 1990s. Egyptian, German, and Italian demining teams, supported by European Union and NATO funding, have been working these sites for decades. The mines are still there. People are still being killed by them. Rommel's Devil's Garden has been active for more than 80 years, outlasting the Wehrmacht, the Afrika Korps, the British Empire, and the political architecture of the war that produced it. The 500,000 mines that the Panzer Army's pioneer units laid across the El Alamein front in September and October of 1942 represent, at an average weight of 9.5 kilograms each, roughly 4,200 tons of metal buried in the Egyptian sand. The tactical purpose they served lasted 13 days. The humanitarian cost they have produced has been continuous since the autumn of 1942 and will continue for years beyond this recording. In the Journal of Mine Action, in the Human Rights Watch landmine reports from the late 1990s, and in the Egyptian government's own mine clearance documentation, El Alamein appears not as a historical event, but as a current emergency, a problem that outlasted the war by 80 years and counting. Rommel designed the Devil's Garden to stop Montgomery's armor for long enough to change the battle's outcome. He failed in that objective. The garden is still killing people. To me, the letter from the Cairo embassy, the unsigned paragraph about Egyptians celebrating their survival rather than a British victory, is the document that most accurately frames what El Alamein actually decided. Not which general was smarter, not whether the crumbling strategy was preconceived or adapted, not whether the pursuit should have been faster, or whether Montgomery deserves more credit than he received or less than he claimed. Those questions matter, and this documentary has tried to address them seriously. But behind them, and larger than all of them, is the simpler fact that a city of several million people was 90 kilometers from a front where, if the logistics had been slightly different, or the intelligence slightly less complete, or the geology slightly less decisive, a regime engaged in industrialized murder might have arrived. The Egyptians in the streets of Cairo in November of 1942 weren't celebrating Montgomery's generalship, or Churchill's political management, or Bletchley Park's analytical precision. They were celebrating being alive. The distinction, as the unnamed embassy officer wrote, is real, and he was right to be moved by it. The lamp on the survey officer's desk in the canvas tent at the beginning of this story, the man reading topographical cross-sections in the summer of 1942, was extinguished before morning. The survey was filed. The map notation was made. 3 words: no bypass. Outside, the desert returned to its ordinary silence, which is the silence of a place that has no interest in the purposes of the people who pass through it. The salt crust of the Qattara Depression sat unchanged below the summer heat, as it had sat for millennia before any of this began, and as it sits today, bearing the weight of nothing because nothing can cross it. The geology held, everything else followed.